Three family members thought they could push around a quiet female veteran and steal her rightful inheritance. They had no idea she'd secretly been supporting their dying father for years while they were nowhere to be found. What happened in that lawyer's office changed everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and what someone truly deserves. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Hartwell Associates law firm in downtown Richmond, Virginia, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table where four people sat in uncomfortable silence. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone knew this meeting would change their family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Diana Danny Rodriguez sat quietly at the far end of the table, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap. At 34, the former Army medic looked older than her years, with premature gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions made under pressure. She wore a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis, clean but clearly not expensive. Her posture was straight, military bearings still evident even in civilian clothes, though she'd been out of the service for 2 years now. Across from her sat her three half-siblings, children from her father's second marriage, and they couldn't have been more different from Diana if they'd tried. Rebecca Martinez-Chun, 31, was a successful real estate agent in Austin, Texas, her designer suit and diamond jewelry making it clear she'd done well for herself. Her manicured nails drummed impatiently on the table as she kept checking her phone, clearly annoyed at having to fly back to Virginia for this meeting. Next to Rebecca sat her younger brother, Marcus Martinez, 29, who worked in tech consulting in Seattle. He'd driven up in his brand-new Tesla Model S, which he'd made sure to park where everyone could see it through the window. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one who went to Stanford on their father's dime, and never seemed to want for anything. The youngest was Isabella Martinez, 26. Fresh out of law school at Georgetown and already working for a prestigious firm in Washington, D.C. She sat with a legal pad in front of her taking notes despite the fact that this wasn't even her case. Isabella had always been the smartest of the three, but also the most entitled, believing her expensive education and connections made her superior to everyone else in the room. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Hartwell, a distinguished woman in her 60s who'd been practicing estate law for over 30 years. She'd known the Rodriguez family for decades, having handled their father's business affairs since he'd started his construction company in the 90s. Today, however, she looked uncomfortable, her usual professional composure strained by what she knew was coming. The meeting had been called to read the will of Roberto Rodriguez, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 weeks earlier at the age of 68. Roberto had built a successful construction business from nothing, starting as a day laborer and eventually employing over 50 people across Virginia and North Carolina. He'd been a proud man, tough but fair, who believed in hard work and taking care of family. Danny stared out the window at the bustling street below, her mind wandering to the last conversation she'd had with her father just 3 days before Roberto passed. They'd been sitting on the old man's back porch, sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Roberto had seemed tired but content, talking about his pride in the business he'd built and his hopes for his children's future. Mija, Roberto had said in his gravelly voice, using the Spanish endearment he'd always called Diana. I know things haven't always been easy between us, especially after your mother died, but you're the one who stayed. You're the one who helped me when I needed it most. Diana had brushed off the comment at the time, uncomfortable with emotional conversations as most veterans tended to be. But now, sitting in this sterile conference room, those words carried more weight. Her father had been right about one thing: Diana had stayed. While her half-siblings had moved away to pursue their careers and lives in other states, Diana had remained in Richmond, close enough to visit regularly and help when needed. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was the product of Roberto's first marriage to Maria Rodriguez, who had died in a car accident when Diana was just 16. Roberto had remarried 2 years later to Carmen Martinez, a woman 15 years younger who brought ambition and social climbing instincts that had clearly rubbed off on her children. Carmen had passed away from cancer 5 years ago, but not before ensuring her children understood they were destined for bigger and better things than their father's blue-collar lifestyle. Rebecca shifted in her chair and sighed loudly, clearly impatient to get this over with. "Can we please get started?" she said, her Texas accent carrying a sharp edge. "Some of us have flights to catch. I have 3 showings scheduled for this afternoon, and my clients don't like to be kept waiting." Marcus nodded in agreement, not looking up from his phone where he was apparently handling some urgent work crisis. "Yeah, I've got a video conference with a client in Tokyo in 2 hours. Time zones don't wait for family drama." Isabella looked up from her legal pad with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure this won't take long," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who thought she already knew how this would play out. "Dad's will is probably pretty straightforward. Split the business and assets 4 ways, maybe with some specific bequests for sentimental items." Diana said nothing, continuing to stare out the window. She'd learned long ago that her half-siblings saw her as an afterthought, the daughter from the first marriage, who'd never quite fit into their mother's vision of a successful, upwardly mobile family. While they'd been encouraged to pursue college and professional careers, Diana had enlisted in the Army right out of high school, drawn by a sense of duty and a desire to serve something bigger than herself. Her military service had taken her to Afghanistan twice, and Iraq once, where she'd worked as a combat medic, treating wounded soldiers under fire and making life-or-death decisions in impossible situations. She'd saved lives, lost friends, and come home with invisible scars that made civilian life feel surreal and disconnected. The transition had been difficult, made harder by the fact that her family seemed to view her service as a detour rather than a sacrifice. Eleanor Hartwell cleared her throat and opened the thick folder in front of her. "Thank you all for coming today. I know this is a difficult time for your family, and I want to express my condolences once again for your loss. Roberto was a good man who worked hard to provide for all of you." She paused, glancing around the table with an expression that Danny couldn't quite read. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of anticipation and concern that made him wonder what exactly was in that will. "Before we begin," Eleanor continued, "I want you to know that your father spent considerable time over the past 2 years updating and revising his will. He was very specific about his wishes and asked me multiple times to ensure that his intentions were carried out exactly as written." Rebecca rolled her eyes, slightly. "Of course he was specific. Dad always was a control freak, even from the grave, apparently." The comment stung Danny more than he expected. Roberto Rodriguez had been many things: stern, demanding, old-fashioned in some ways, but he'd never been cruel or unfair. He'd simply been a man who believed in earning what you got and taking responsibility for your actions. Eleanor's expression tightened at Rebecca's disrespectful comment, but she maintained her professional composure. "Your father's primary concern was ensuring that his legacy would be preserved and that those who had truly supported him and the family business would be appropriately recognized." Marcus finally looked up from his phone, sensing something in the lawyer's tone that suggested this might not be the routine reading they'd all expected. "What do you mean by those who had truly supported him?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of suspicion. Diana felt a strange sensation in her chest, part anticipation and part dread. Something about Eleanor's careful word choice and the way she kept glancing in her direction suggested that this meeting was about to take an unexpected turn. She thought again about her father's words on the porch, about staying and helping when needed, and wondered if Roberto had meant more by them than she'd realized at the time. The morning sun had shifted higher in the sky, and the shadows in the conference room had shortened, but the tension remained as thick as ever. Whatever was in that will, Diana had the feeling it was going to change everything they thought they knew about their father, their family, and what each of them truly deserved. Eleanor Hartwell adjusted her reading glasses and opened the thick legal document before her. The room fell into a heavy silence as she prepared to read Roberto Rodriguez's final wish. Diana noticed how the lawyer's hands seemed to tremble slightly as she turned to the first page, and there was something in Eleanor's expression that suggested this wasn't going to be the straightforward division her half-siblings expect. "I, Roberto Miguel Rodriguez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor began, her voice clear and professional despite the tension in the room. I revoke all previous wills and codicils made by me. Rebecca shifted impatiently in her designer chair, already mentally calculating her share of the construction business and the family home. She'd done some quick research on her father's assets and estimated the total estate value at somewhere around $3 million. Split 4 ways, that would be enough to pay off her mortgage in Austin and maybe invest in some rental properties. Marcus was thinking along similar lines, though his plans involved expanding his tech consulting business and maybe finally buying that vacation home in Aspen he'd been on. He glanced at Diana with barely concealed disdain, wondering why their father had insisted on including her in the will at all. After all, what had she really contributed to the family's success? Isabella, meanwhile, was taking notes with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 years studying contract law. She was confident that her legal education would help her navigate any complications that might arise, and she'd already mentally prepared arguments for why the business assets should be divided based on education level and earning potential rather than simple equality. Eleanor continued reading through the standard legal language, but Diana could sense the older woman building up to something significant. There was a rhythm to these proceedings that Eleanor clearly knew by heart, but today felt different. The lawyer kept pausing to look at Diana with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if she knew what was coming would change everything. To my beloved daughter Diana Rodriguez, Eleanor read, and the room suddenly felt electric with attention. I leave the sum of $50,000, my collection of military memorabilia, and my heartfelt gratitude for her service to our country. Rebecca let out a barely audible sigh of relief. $50,000 was more than she'd expected Diana to receive, but it was still a relatively small portion of the overall estate. Marcus nodded approvingly, thinking this seemed about right for someone who'd chosen military service over a real career. But Eleanor wasn't finished. However, she continued, and her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward. I must first address a matter that has weighed heavily on my heart for the past several years. Diana felt her pulse quicken. Something in Eleanor's tone suggested that the straightforward reading her siblings expected was about to take a very different turn. For the past 4 years, Eleanor read slowly, my daughter Diana has been providing significant financial support to help maintain my household and medical expenses. This support, which she provided quietly and without fanfare, totaled over $200,000 and allowed me to maintain my independence and dignity during my declining health. The silence in the room was deafening. Rebecca's mouth fell open, and her pen clattered to the table. Marcus actually dropped his phone, the sound echoing in the suddenly tense space. Isabella's careful note-taking stopped abruptly as she stared at Eleanor in disbelief. Diana felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She'd never wanted her father to mention the money she'd been sending him. It hadn't been about recognition or future inheritance. It had simply been the right thing to do. When Roberto's health had started failing and his business had slowed down, she'd noticed him struggling with basic expenses. Her own life was simple, her needs minimal, and she'd had savings from her military service that weren't being used. What do you mean financial support? Rebecca demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. Dad never mentioned needing money. His business was successful. Eleanor looked at Rebecca with the patience of someone who'd dealt with difficult family dynamics for decades. Your father was very proud, Mrs. Martinez. He didn't want to burden his children with his financial difficulties, especially those who had moved away and established their own successful lives. Marcus leaned forward aggressively. That's impossible. Diana works at some dead-end job. She couldn't possibly have had $200,000 to give away. Actually, Eleanor said calmly, consulting another document. Diana has been working as a paramedic supervisor for Richmond Emergency Services since leaving the military, a position that pays quite well. Additionally, she received disability compensation for injuries sustained during her service, and she lived very modestly, allowing her to save a substantial portion of her income. Isabella's legal mind was already working through the implication. Are you saying that Diana essentially provided a loan to our father? because if so, that money should be deducted from her inheritance, not added to it. Eleanor's expression grew stern. I'm saying that Diana provided this support as gifts, with no expectation of repayment. Your father documented every transaction, along with notes expressing his gratitude and concern that his other children might not understand the sacrifices she was making. She pulled out a separate folder and placed it on the table. Roberto kept detailed records of every contribution Diana made, along with letters explaining how this support allowed him to maintain his dignity and continue living independently. He also documented his attempts to reach out to his other children during this difficult period. Diana wanted to sink through the floor. This wasn't how she'd wanted her siblings to find out about the money. She'd hoped her father would keep it private, just between them. The last thing she'd ever wanted was for it to become a source of family conflict. Rebecca's face had gone pale, and her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and something that might have been guilt. Dad never told us he was having financial problems. He should have called us. We would have helped. Would you? Eleanor asked quietly, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. According to Roberto's notes, he did reach out several times over the past few years. He called when he was in the hospital for his heart surgery. He called when Carmen's medical bills were overwhelming him. He called when the business was struggling during the pandemic. Marcus and Rebecca exchanged uncomfortable glances. They both remembered those calls, but they'd been brief conversations focused on reassurance that everything was fine. Their father had never directly asked for money, and they'd been too busy with their own lives to read between the lines. Isabella, ever the lawyer, tried a different approach. Even if Diana did provide financial support, that doesn't change the legal structure of inheritance. A will is a will, and emotional considerations don't override legal ones. Eleanor smiled grimly. You're absolutely right, Miss Martinez, which brings us to the most important part of your father's will. She turned to a new page, and Diana could see that there were several more pages to go. Whatever was coming next, it was clear that the $50,000 mentioned earlier was just the beginning. The late morning sun had shifted position, and the shadows in the conference room had moved across the mahogany table like a sundial marking the passage of time. But for the four Rodriguez siblings, time seemed to have stopped entirely, as they waited to hear what other surprises their father's will contained. Diana stared at her hands, wishing she could disappear. All she'd ever wanted was to help her father during a difficult time, the same way he'd helped her through her own struggles after returning from deployment. She'd never imagined it would lead to this moment, sitting in a lawyer's office while her siblings looked at her with expressions ranging from shock to resentment, to something that might have been grudging respect. Whatever came next, Diana knew that this family meeting was going to change everything between them forever. Eleanor Hartwell turned to the next section of the will, her expression growing more serious with each page. The revelation about Diana's financial support had clearly shaken the three Martinez siblings, but it was obvious from the lawyer's demeanor that the biggest surprises were yet to come. Diana noticed how Eleanor kept glancing at her with what seemed like a mixture of sympathy and anticipation, as if she knew the next few minutes would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. Now we come to the matter of the family business, Rodriguez Construction Company, Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. Your father spent considerable time thinking about the future of the company he built from nothing. Rebecca leaned forward eagerly, her earlier shock giving way to renewed interest in the financial aspects of the inheritance. Despite the revelation about Diana's contributions, she still expected the business to be divided equally among the four siblings. After all, that's how these things typically worked, and Roberto had always talked about the company being his legacy for all his children. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a calculator app, already running numbers in his head. The construction company had been valued at approximately $1.8 million in assets, including equipment, contracts and real estate. Even split 4 ways, his share would be substantial enough to make a real difference in his tech consulting business expansion plan. Isabella had her legal pad ready, prepared to take detailed notes about the business structure and ownership percentages. Her law school training had taught her that business inheritance could be complicated, but she assumed her father would have chosen the most straightforward approach. She was already thinking about how to convert her share into liquid assets as quickly as possible, since none of the siblings had any interest in actually running a construction company. To Rebecca Martinez Chen, Marcus Martinez, and Isabella Martinez, Eleanor read slowly, "I leave my gratitude for their professional accomplishments, and my hope that they will continue to find success in their chosen career." The three siblings waited expectantly for the details about their shares of the business, but Eleanor paused and turned to a new page without mentioning any specific bequest. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they realized that their names had been mentioned, but no actual inheritance had been specified. "Wait," Rebecca said, her voice tight with confusion. "What about our shares of the company? You just read our names, but didn't mention any percentages or assets." Eleanor looked at her calmly. "I read exactly what your father wrote, Mrs. Martinez Chen, his gratitude and his hopes for your continued success." Marcus felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. "That can't be right. Dad wouldn't have left us out of the business entirely." "There must be something else." "There is indeed something else," Eleanor confirmed, turning to the next section. "Rodriguez Construction Company, including all assets, contracts, equipment, real estate holdings, and future business interests. I leave entirely to my daughter Diana Rodriguez." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Isabella's pen fell from her hand, Rebecca made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach, and Marcus actually stood up from his chair, his face flushing red with shock and anger. "That's impossible," Rebecca shouted, her composure completely shattered. "Dad wouldn't do that. The business was supposed to be for all of us." Diana felt like the world had tilted on its axis. She'd expected maybe a small portion of the business, perhaps as recognition for her support over the years, but the entire company, it seemed impossible, overwhelming, and frankly terrifying. She'd never run a business, never managed employees, or handled complex construction contracts. Eleanor held up her hand for silence. "There's more. Your father included a detailed explanation for this decision." She cleared her throat and began reading again. "I leave the business to Diana not only because of her financial support during my difficult years, but because she was the only one of my children who showed genuine interest in the company and its employees." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "Interest? She never worked for the company." "None of us did. We had our own careers. According to your father's notes," Eleanor continued calmly, "Diana spent numerous weekends and evenings at job sites over the past 2 years, helping with paperwork, learning about the business operations, and getting to know the employee." He writes here that she was the only one who ever asked about the workers' families, or showed concern for their welfare during the pandemic. Diana remembered those visits, but she'd never thought of them as preparing to take over the business. She'd simply wanted to help her father during a stressful time, and she'd genuinely enjoyed meeting the hard-working people who'd helped build the company's reputation. When several employees had been struggling financially during COVID, she'd even helped her father figure out how to keep them on payroll using federal assistance programs. Isabella, her legal training kicking in despite her shock, tried to regain control of the situation. "This has to be undue influence," she declared. "Diana obviously manipulated our father when he was vulnerable and elderly. No court would uphold a will this obviously unfair." Eleanor's expression grew stern. "Martinez, I've been practicing estate law for over 30 years, and I can assure you that Roberto Rodriguez was of completely sound mind when he made these decisions. We have medical documentation from 3 different doctors confirming his mental competency, and I personally witnessed his signature on multiple occasions over a 2-year period as he refined his wishes." She pulled out another thick fold. "Furthermore, your father anticipated that there might be challenges to his will, so he documented his reasoning extensively. He wrote detailed letters explaining each decision, and he asked me to include video testimony explaining his wishes." Rebecca's voice cracked with emotion and anger. "You don't deserve this," she said, pointing an accusatory finger at Diana. "You manipulated a sick old man into leaving you everything. You're nothing but a gold digger who took advantage of his loneliness." The accusation hit Diana like a slap. She'd never wanted any of this conflict, and she certainly hadn't supported her father with any expectation of financial gain. The money she'd sent him had come from her own savings, money she'd earned through her military service and her work as a paramedic supervisor. She'd helped him because he was her father and he needed help, not because she was angling for an inheritance. Marcus was pacing behind his chair now, his tech executive composure completely shattered. This is insane. We're supposed to accept that our sister, who works as a glorified ambulance driver, now owns a multi-million-dollar construction company. She doesn't know the first thing about running a business. Actually, Eleanor said quietly, your father included provisions for that as well. Diana will have full support from the company's existing management team, and Roberto arranged for a transition period with the current foreman, Miguel Santos, who has been with the company for 15 years. Isabella was frantically scribbling notes, her mind already working through potential legal challenges. We're going to contest this will. This is clearly the result of emotional manipulation, and possibly elder abuse. No reasonable person would leave an entire business to someone with no relevant experience while cutting out successful, educated children. Diana finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to help Dad when he needed it. Oh please, Rebecca snapped. Don't play innocent now. You saw an opportunity with a lonely widower, and you took it. You probably counted on us being too busy with our real lives to notice what you were doing. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be painful. Diana had been the only one who'd stayed close, the only one who'd made time for regular visits and phone calls, but that hadn't been calculated. It had simply been what felt right. Her father had raised her, supported her through her mother's death and her own struggles with military service. When he'd needed help, she'd provided it without thinking about the consequences or potential rewards. Eleanor consulted her watch and gathered several more documents. I'm afraid there's still more to discuss. Your father's will contains several additional provisions that I believe will surprise all of you. The afternoon sun was streaming through the conference room windows now, casting long shadows across the table where a family was being torn apart by revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about fairness, loyalty, and what children owed their parents. Diana stared at her hands, wishing she could disappear, while her 3 half-siblings glared at her with a mixture of rage, betrayal and disbelief. Whatever else their father's will contained, it was clear that the Rodriguez family would never be the same again. Eleanor Hartwell's expression had grown increasingly stern as she listened to the 3 Martinez siblings hurl accusations at Diana. The elderly lawyer had witnessed countless family disputes over the years, but the venom and entitlement displayed by Rebecca, Marcus and Isabella was particularly distasteful. She glanced at Diana, who sat quietly enduring the verbal assault with the same stoic composure she'd probably shown under fire in Afghanistan. I think, Eleanor said firmly, her voice cutting through the siblings' continued protests, that before you make any more accusations about manipulation or undue influence, you should hear the complete truth about your father's situation and Diana's role in his life over the past several years. Isabella looked up from her frantic note-taking, her face flushed with anger. What more could there possibly be? She already admitted to giving him money, which clearly created a conflict of interest that influenced his decision-making. Eleanor opened yet another folder, this one thicker than all the previous documents combined. Your father didn't just document Diana's financial contributions, he kept detailed records of every interaction he had with all of his children over the past 5 years. He also asked me to compile additional evidence that he felt would be necessary to defend his decisions. Marcus crossed his arms defensively. Evidence of what? We've already established that we had successful careers in other states. Of course we couldn't visit as often as someone who chose to stay local and work a basic job. A basic job, Eleanor repeated slowly, and there was something dangerous in her tone. Let me read you some excerpts from your father's private notes, which he specifically requested be shared if his will was challenged. She pulled out a leather-bound journal and opened it to a bookmarked page. March 15, 2021. Diana came by today to help me organize the medical bills from Carmen's final treatment. I hadn't told the kids how overwhelming the paperwork had become, Diana spent 6 hours sorting everything and helped me understand which bills insurance would cover. She also noticed that I'd been overcharged for several procedures and helped me file appeals that saved almost $12,000. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She vaguely remembered her father mentioning something about medical bills during one of their brief phone calls, but she'd been in the middle of closing a major real estate deal and had assumed he was just venting about insurance companies. Eleanor continued reading. July 3, 2021, Diana drove me to my cardiac specialist appointment today because I was too nervous to drive myself after the chest pains last week. The doctor wants to schedule surgery, but I'm scared. Diana stayed for the entire consultation and asked all the right questions that I was too worried to think of. She's taking time off work to be with me during the procedure next week. Wait, Marcus interrupted, his voice less certain than before. Dad had heart surgery? What? He never told us about any heart surgery. Eleanor looked at him with barely concealed disgust. According to his notes, he called all 3 of you the day before his surgery. Rebecca, you were showing houses to clients and said you'd call him back later but never did. Marcus, you were in a client meeting and asked him to text you the details, which you never responded to. Isabella, you were studying for the bar exam and told him you couldn't deal with family drama during such an important time. The silence in the room was deafening. Diana remembered that day vividly. She'd taken a week of unpaid leave to care for her father after his triple bypass surgery, sleeping on his couch and helping him with basic tasks while he recovered. She'd never mentioned to her siblings how frightened he'd been or how he'd cried with relief when the surgery was successful. Eleanor turned to another page. September 12, 2022, Hurricane Isabel caused significant damage to the construction company's equipment yard, lost almost $200,000 in machinery to flooding. Insurance will cover most of it, but the deductible and temporary equipment rental costs are crushing. Diana found out about the situation and immediately offered to help with the cost. She didn't ask questions or lecture me about better insurance coverage. She just asked how much I needed and transferred the money the same day. Isabella's legal mind was working frantically to process this new information. If the business was in such financial trouble, why didn't Dad tell us? We could have helped figure out solutions. Could you have? Eleanor asked pointedly. She pulled out a printed email thread. Your father did reach out for advice. He sent detailed emails to all 3 of you explaining the hurricane damage and asking for guidance on how to handle the insurance claims and temporary financing needs. She handed the papers to Isabella. Rebecca responded 2 weeks later with a suggestion to call her insurance agent in Texas, who obviously couldn't help with Virginia claims. Marcus sent a 1-line reply recommending he hire a consultant to handle it. You, Isabella, never responded at all. Diana remembered getting her father's panicked phone call about the hurricane damage. She'd driven straight to the equipment yard in the pouring rain, helping him assess the damage and take photos for the insurance claim. When she'd seen how devastated he was about the potential impact on his employees, she'd offered financial help without hesitation. Eleanor wasn't finished. She pulled out a medical folder with hospital letterhead. January 2023. Your father was hospitalized for 3 days with pneumonia complications. Diana was listed as his emergency contact because, according to his notes, she was the only one who consistently answered his call. She spent 2 nights sleeping in the hospital chair and coordinated all his care with the medical team. Marcus's face had gone pale. I never knew he was in the hospital. He didn't call me. Actually, he did. Eleanor showed him another phone log. You were in Japan on business and told him to handle it himself because you couldn't travel internationally for minor health issues. Rebecca, you were at a real estate conference in Miami and said you'd try to visit when you got back. But you never did. Isabella, you were starting your new job and said you couldn't take time off during your first week. The weight of their neglect was settling over the 3 siblings like a heavy blanket. Each revelation showed a pattern of their father reaching out for support, connection, or simply communication, only to be dismissed or ignored because their own lives were too busy or important. Eleanor turned to the final section of document. But perhaps the most telling evidence of Diana's character versus the rest of yours is what happened last Christmas. She pulled out a folder filled with receipts and photographs. Your father wanted to do something special for his employees' families, many of whom were struggling financially. He had an idea to give each family $1,000 bonus, but the business couldn't afford it after the hurricane losses and his medical expenses. Diana felt her stomach clench. She remembered that conversation, her father's disappointment at not being able to help his workers during the holidays. Diana didn't just contribute the money for the employee bonuses, Eleanor continued. She helped your father research each family's specific needs. The Sanchez family needed help with their daughter's medical expenses. The Williams family was behind on their mortgage after Mrs. Williams lost her job. Diana helped coordinate not just cash gifts, but specific assistance tailored to each family's situation. She spent her own Christmas Day delivering gifts and aid to 12 different families. Eleanor placed a stack of thank you cards on the table. These are letters from the employees' families, thanking Diana for her kindness and generosity. Several of them mention that she was the reason they didn't lose their homes or couldn't afford their children's medical care. Rebecca, Marcus, and Isabella stared at the cards in stunned silence. The picture Eleanor was painting was of a sister they barely knew, someone who had quietly been holding their father's world together while they pursued their own ambitions, hundreds of miles away. So when you ask whether Diana deserves this inheritance, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, I would suggest that the real question is whether the rest of you deserve anything at all. The afternoon sun had shifted again and the conference room felt smaller, more suffocating. Diana sat in her chair, overwhelmed by the public revelation of actions she'd taken simply because they felt right. She'd never wanted recognition or gratitude, she'd just wanted to help her father and the people who depended on him. But as she looked at her half-siblings' faces, she realized that Eleanor wasn't finished. The lawyer was reaching for one final folder, and her expression suggested that the biggest revelation was yet to come. Eleanor Hartwell opened the final folder with the gravity of someone about to deliver a verdict that would change everything. The three Martinez siblings sat in stunned silence, their earlier accusations and entitlement replaced by a growing awareness of their own failures as children. Diana remained quiet, still processing the public revelation of actions she'd taken in private, never expecting recognition or reward. There is one final matter to address, Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence. Your father's most recent codicil, added just 6 weeks before his death, after he received some particularly distressing news about his children's priority. Isabella, her legal training making her suspicious of last-minute changes, leaned forward. What kind of codicil? Any modifications made that close to death could be evidence of diminished capacity or undue influence. Eleanor's smile was cold. Actually, this codicil was prompted by a very specific incident that crystallized your father's understanding of his children's true character. She pulled out a printed email chain. Rebecca, do you remember the email your father sent you in early February? Rebecca's face went pale. She had a sinking feeling she knew exactly which email Eleanor was referring to, and it wasn't one she was proud of. Let me refresh your memory, Eleanor continued, adjusting her reading glasses. Your father wrote to inform you that he had been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. He explained that while the prognosis was good, he would need surgery and several weeks of recovery. He asked if any of his children might be able to visit during this difficult time. Diana felt her breath catch. Her father had never told her about any cancer diagnosis. She'd known he'd been tired lately and had seemed worried about something, but he'd brushed off her concerns, saying it was just business stress. Eleanor began reading from the email thread. Rebecca's response: Dad, I'm sorry to hear about your diagnosis, but I'm in the middle of my biggest sales quarter ever. I'm up for a promotion to regional manager, and I can't take time off right now. Maybe Isabella can help since she's closer geographically. I'll try to visit once things settle down at work. Love you. The silence in the room was deafening. Rebecca stared at her hands, her earlier righteousness completely deflated. Marcus, Eleanor continued relentlessly, your response was that sucks, Dad. I'm sure you'll be fine though, you're tough. I'm launching a new product line with a major client in Tokyo, so I'll be traveling for the next 2 months. Can't Diana help? She doesn't have anything important going on anyway. Let me know how the surgery goes. Marcus had gone completely wild. Those words, typed hastily during a busy day, sounded monstrous when read aloud in this context. And Eleanor's voice carried particular disdain. Your response was perhaps the most telling. Dad, you're being dramatic. Prostate cancer is totally treatable these days. I'm studying for the patent law certification exam, which could make or break my career trajectory. I can't afford any distractions right now. You should hire a private nurse if you need help. You can afford it. Isabella felt sick. She remembered writing that email, annoyed at what she'd perceived as her father's tendency toward hyperbole about health issues. She'd convinced herself he was exaggerating the seriousness of the situation. Your father never responded to any of those emails, Eleanor continued. Instead, he wrote this in his journal. She opened the leather-bound book to a page marked with a red ribbon, February 18th. Today I learned which of my children truly loves me. Rebecca is too busy with her career. Marcus thinks I'm an inconvenience. Isabella believes I'm being dramatic about cancer, but Diana somehow sensed something was wrong even though I hadn't told her about the diagnosis. Eleanor turned the page. When Diana came for our regular Sunday dinner, she noticed I seemed worried and kept asking gentle questions until I finally admitted the truth. Her first reaction wasn't to think about her own schedule or career. She immediately asked what I needed and how she could help. When I said the surgery was scheduled for the following week, she didn't hesitate. She said, "I'm taking time off. You're not going through this alone." Diana remembered that conversation. She'd seen the fear in her father's eyes when he'd finally admitted the cancer diagnosis, and she'd known immediately that her presence during the surgery and recovery wasn't optional. It was essential. Diana took 2 weeks of unpaid leave, Eleanor continued. She drove your father to all his pre-surgery appointments, researched the procedure and recovery process, prepared his house for his return, and stayed with him for 10 days after the surgery. She slept on his couch, helped him with physical therapy exercises, managed his medications, and provided the emotional support he needed during one of the most frightening experiences of his life. Eleanor pulled out a medical release form. With your father's permission, I contacted his oncologist, Dr. Patricia Hendricks. She specifically mentioned Diana in her notes, saying she'd never seen a more dedicated caregiver. Hendricks said Diana's presence and advocacy significantly improved your father's recovery and emotional well-being. Marcus tried to defend himself. We didn't know it was that serious. Dad always minimized his health issues. He minimized them, Eleanor replied sharply, because he'd learned that his other children saw his needs as inconveniences to their important lives. Diana was the only one who looked beyond his words to see his fear. Eleanor turned to the final page of the will, which brings us to your father's ultimate decision about his estate. The construction company was just the beginning. She began reading the final provisions. To Rebecca Martinez Chen, Marcus Martinez, and Isabella Martinez, who have built successful lives and clearly need no further support from their father, I leave the sum of $5,000 each, along with my hope that they will someday understand the difference between achievement and character. The small amount was clearly intended as an insult, a token gesture that emphasized their father's disappointment rather than his generosity. However, Eleanor continued, to Diana Rodriguez, who has shown me more love, loyalty and sacrifice than I ever deserved, I leave not only the construction company, but also my entire personal estate, including the family home, all investment accounts, life insurance policies, and a special fund I have been building specifically for her future. She placed a bank statement on the table. Your father had been setting aside money for Diana's future for the past 3 years, money he'd planned to use for his own retirement, but decided she deserved more. The total value of Diana's inheritance, including the business, properties and cash assets, is approximately 4.2. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Rebecca made a choking sound. Marcus actually stood up and began pacing. Isabella stared at the bank statement, in disbelief. $4 million. Rebecca whispered. $4 million? Eleanor nodded. Your father's final note explains his reasoning. Diana has already given me more than I ever gave her, This inheritance isn't charity, it's recognition of a debt I can never fully repay. She deserves this and more. My other children have made it clear that their success and happiness don't depend on me. Diana's actions have shown me that love isn't about what you achieve for yourself, but what you sacrifice for others. Diana sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her father had done. She'd never expected anything, certainly not millions of dollars. All she'd ever wanted was to help him through difficult times, the same way any child should help their parent. Rebecca's voice cracked with a mixture of anguish and anger. This isn't fair. You can't buy love with money, and you can't punish your children for having successful careers. Eleanor closed the file with finality. Your father wasn't buying love, Mrs. Martinez-Chen. He was recognizing the love that already existed. He wasn't punishing you for your success. He was acknowledging that your success came at the cost of your relationship with him. The late afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows through the conference room window. Eleanor gathered her documents with the efficiency of someone who had delivered many difficult truths over the years. Diana, she said gently, you'll need time to process all of this. I've arranged for a transition meeting with Miguel Santos and the company's management team next week. Your father left detailed instructions for how he wanted the business to be handled, and you'll have all the support you need. As the meeting concluded and the siblings prepared to leave, Rebecca turned to Diana one last time. You were right, she said quietly, her earlier hostility replaced by something that might have been regret. He was right, you did deserve more. The words came out like an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that everything they'd thought they knew about fairness and family had been turned upside down. Diana nodded silently, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Outside the conference room windows, Richmond continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside one family had been forever changed by the revelation of what true love and sacrifice actually looked like. 3 months after the devastating will reading, the full consequences of Roberto Rodriguez's final decisions had rippled through the family and the wider Richmond community in ways that none of the siblings could have anticipated. The story of the veteran daughter who inherited everything, while her successful siblings received almost nothing, had become something of a local legend, shared in coffee shops, construction sites, and veteran support groups across Virginia. Diana stood in the office that had once been her father's, looking out at the Rodriguez Construction Company yard, where workers were preparing for the day's project. The transition to ownership had been smoother than she'd expected, largely thanks to Miguel Santos, the longtime foreman who had become her mentor and guide in understanding the complex world of construction management. The employees, who had witnessed Diana's quiet support over the years, had rallied around her with a loyalty that spoke volumes about the kind of person she was. Rodriguez, Miguel called from the doorway, using the formal title he'd insisted on since she became the official owner, though his voice carried the warmth of genuine respect. The Patterson project team is ready for the final walkthrough, and the Hendricks family wants to personally thank you for the scholarship fund. Diana nodded, still adjusting to the reality of her new life. The scholarship fund, Miguel referenced, was one of several initiatives she'd started with her inheritance money, providing educational support for the children of construction workers and veterans. It wasn't something she'd planned, it had simply felt like the right thing to do with the unexpected wealth her father had left her. The business itself had not only survived the transition, but had actually begun to thrive under Diana's leadership. Her military experience with logistics and personnel management had translated surprisingly well to construction project oversight, and her genuine care for the workers had created a company culture that attracted the best talent in the region. 3 major contracts had been signed in the past month alone, with clients specifically requesting Rodriguez Construction, because of their reputation for treating employees well and completing projects with integrity. Meanwhile, the 3 Martinez siblings were dealing with the aftermath of their public humiliation, in very different ways. Rebecca had returned to Austin, but her real estate career had suffered when the story of the will reading had spread through social media. Several high-profile clients had quietly moved their business elsewhere, uncomfortable with being associated with someone who had so callously dismissed their father's cancer diagnosis. Her marriage was also under strain, As her husband struggled to understand how the woman he'd married could have been so cold to her dying father, Rebecca had tried to repair her reputation by making public statements about family misunderstandings and the complexities of long-distance relationships, but the damage was largely done. The real estate industry was built on trust and personal relationships, and the story of her father's desperate emails and her dismissive responses had created a narrative that was difficult to overcome. Marcus had fared somewhat better professionally, but his personal life had taken a significant hit. His girlfriend of 3 years had broken up with him after learning about his treatment of his father, telling him that she couldn't build a future with someone who prioritized business trips over family medical emergencies. His tech consulting clients hadn't abandoned him, but several had made pointed comments about the importance of work-life balance and family values that left him feeling uncomfortable and judged. More troubling for Marcus was his growing awareness of how his priorities had warped over the years. The will reading had forced him to confront the reality that he'd become the kind of person who measured human worth by professional achievement and financial success. The revelation that Diana, whom he'd dismissed as underachieving, had been quietly performing acts of extraordinary generosity and sacrifice had shaken his entire worldview. Isabella's situation was perhaps the most complex. As a new lawyer, she had initially considered challenging the will, believing she could find legal grounds to contest their father's decision. However, after reviewing Eleanor Hartwell's meticulous documentation and consulting with several senior partners at her firm, she'd been forced to admit that the will was legally ironclad. More damaging to her professionally was the fact that her colleagues had learned about her suggestion that her father was being dramatic about his cancer diagnosis. The legal profession, despite its reputation for cold calculation, placed enormous value on family loyalty and personal integrity. Isabella found herself relegated to less prestigious cases and excluded from social events where her character had become a subject of quiet speculation. Her carefully planned career trajectory had been derailed by the revelation of her own callousness. But perhaps the most significant change had occurred within Isabella herself. The shock of learning about Diana's sacrifices and her own failures as a daughter had triggered a period of painful self-reflection. She'd begun volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped veterans navigate disability claims and family issues, partly as penance and partly as an attempt to understand the kind of service-oriented mindset that had always driven Diana. Eleanor Hartwell had watched the aftermath unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades ensuring that justice prevailed in family disputes. She'd received calls from other estate attorneys asking about the Rodriguez case, and she'd been invited to speak at several legal conferences about the importance of comprehensive documentation in complex family situations. The case had become a textbook example of how careful preparation and thorough evidence could protect a client's wishes from challenge, but Eleanor's greatest satisfaction came from watching Diana grow into her new role. The young woman who had sat quietly in the conference room, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her inheritance, had blossomed into a confident business owner and community leader. Diana had used her resources not for personal luxury, but to expand her father's legacy of taking care of people who worked hard and deserved support. The Rodriguez Construction Company had established an employee hardship fund, increased health benefits, and created a profit-sharing program that ensured everyone who contributed to the company's success shared in its reward. Diana had also partnered with local veteran organizations to provide job training and employment opportunities for returning service members, understanding from her own experience how difficult the transition to civilian life could be. The story had taken on a life of its own in Richmond's veteran community, where Diana had become something of a folk hero. The narrative of the quiet female veteran who had sacrificed for her family while her successful siblings pursued their own ambitions resonated deeply with men and women who had made similar sacrifices in their own lives. At the monthly meeting of the Richmond Veterans Association, Diana's story was frequently referenced as an example of how service to others ultimately led to recognition and reward, even if that recognition came in unexpected ways. Younger veterans struggling with their own family relationships and career transitions often asked about Diana specifically, wanting to understand how someone could maintain such integrity and generosity in the face of family indifference.
The broader community had also taken note. Diana had been invited to serve on the boards of several charitable organizations, and the local newspaper had featured her in a series about successful women business owners. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Diana, who had been dismissed by her siblings as lacking ambition and achievement, had become one of Richmond's most respected entrepreneurs and philanthropists. As Diana locked up the office that evening and prepared to drive home to the house that had once been her father's, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The inheritance had given her financial security, but more importantly, it had validated years of choices that others had questioned or dismissed. She thought about her father often, wishing he could see how the business was thriving and how his employees' families were benefiting from the foundation she'd established in his memory. Roberto Rodriguez had built more than a construction company. He'd created a legacy of hard work, integrity, and taking care of people who mattered. The evening sun cast long shadows across the equipment yard, and Diana could almost hear her father's voice in the familiar sounds of the workshop being cleaned and secured for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for now she was content knowing that she had honored both her father's memory and the values that had guided her own life of service.
1 year after the will reading that had changed everything, an unexpected phone call would test whether the Rodriguez family could ever find a path toward healing, or if the wounds revealed in Eleanor Hartwell's conference room were too deep to ever mend. Diana was reviewing quarterly reports in her Heather's old office when her secretary knocked on the door. "Ms. Rodriguez, there's a call for you on line 2. It's Rebecca Martinez-Chen, and she says it's important." Diana stared at the blinking light on the phone for a long moment. She hadn't spoken to any of her half-siblings since that devastating afternoon in the lawyer's office. She'd heard through Richmond's small community network that they were all struggling with the aftermath of their public exposure, but she'd made no attempt to reach out. Part of her felt guilty about their situations, but a larger part of her was still processing her own emotions about years of being dismissed and undervalued. "Diana?" Rebecca's voice sounded different when she finally picked up, shaky, uncertain, lacking the confident edge that had always characterized her personality. "Thank you for taking my call. I wasn't sure you would. What do you need, Rebecca?" Diana's tone was neutral, professional. She'd learned in the military not to let personal emotions interfere with necessary communications. There was a long pause before Rebecca continued. "I'm calling because Marcus is in the hospital. He had a heart attack 3 days ago. He's stable now, but it was serious. And Diana, he's been asking for you." The news hit Diana like a physical blow. Marcus was only 29 years old, far too young for heart problems. "What happened? Is he going to be okay?" Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. "The doctors say it was stress-related. His blood pressure had been elevated for months, apparently. His ex-girlfriend said he'd been having panic attacks and wasn't sleeping. The cardiologist thinks the stress of everything that's happened this past year, combined with his work schedule and the guilt he's been carrying about Dad, just overwhelmed his system." Diana closed her eyes, feeling a familiar weight settle in her chest. Even now, even after everything that had happened, her first instinct was to help. "Which hospital?" "Seattle General." "But Diana, I need to tell you something else before you decide whether to come." Rebecca's voice became even more strained. "Isabella and I have been talking a lot over the past few months. About Dad, about you, about the kind of people we became. We've been going to family counseling together, trying to understand how we got so far off track." Diana remained silent, letting Rebecca continue. "The truth is, we were jealous of you long before Dad died. Not of your money or your inheritance, we didn't even know about that. We were jealous of your relationship with him. The way he talked about you when you weren't around. The pride in his voice when he mentioned your military service or your work as a paramedic. We convinced ourselves that you were his favorite, because you stayed local, and we were successful enough to leave. But that wasn't really it, was it?" Rebecca's question hung in the air. Diana had never thought about it in those terms, but she was beginning to understand that her siblings' dismissive treatment of her might have been rooted in their own insecurities, rather than simple arrogance. "Dad loved all of us," Diana said carefully, "but love isn't just a feeling. It's actions. It's showing up when someone needs you, even when it's inconvenient. I know that now, Rebecca whispered. God, Diana, I know that. When Marcus collapsed when the doctors said he might not make it, all I could think about was how we treated Dad when he was scared about his cancer. How we treated you like you were some kind of loser for staying close to home and caring about family. Diana felt tears prick her eye. She'd spent so many years being strong, being the reliable one, that she'd almost forgotten how much the family dynamics had hurt her. The counselor helped us understand something. Rebecca continued. We didn't just fail Dad, we failed you. You were our sister. And instead of appreciating your sacrifices and your character, we looked down on you because your life didn't look like ours. We were so busy proving we were successful that we forgot what success actually meant. The office felt very quiet. Outside, Diana could hear the familiar sounds of the construction crew finishing their day, the same sounds her father had listened to for decades while building something that would outlast him. Marcus has been the worst off since the will reading, Rebecca admitted. He quit his job 2 months ago, said he couldn't focus on client needs when he'd ignored his own father's needs. He's been volunteering at a veterans support center in Seattle, trying to understand the kind of service mindset that you've always had, but the guilt has been eating him alive. Diana thought about her younger half-brother, remembering him as an eager child who had always wanted to impress everyone around him. Somewhere along the way, that eagerness had morphed into a relentless drive for external validation that had cost him his ability to connect with the people who mattered most. Isabella flew up from D.C. as soon as we heard about Marcus. Rebecca continued. She's been at the hospital every day. She wanted to call you herself, but she was afraid you'd hang up on her. She's been carrying a lot of guilt too about how she treated Dad's cancer diagnosis. Diana made a decision that surprised even her. I'll fly up tonight. Text me the hospital details and his room number. The relief in Rebecca's voice was palpable. Diana, thank you. I know we don't deserve your kindness after everything, but Marcus needs to see you. We all need to figure out how to be a family again, if that's even possible. After hanging up, Diana sat in her father's chair, looking at the framed photo on his desk, the one picture he'd kept of all 4 siblings together, taken at Christmas almost 10 years ago when they'd all still believed that success and family could coexist without conflict. She called Miguel Santos to let him know she'd be away for a few days, then booked a red-eye flight to Seattle. As she packed a small bag, Diana thought about the conversation with Rebecca and the glimpse it had provided into her siblings' emotional state over the past year. The will reading had exposed more than just their neglect of their father. It had forced them to confront the kind of people they'd become in pursuit of their individual definitions of success. Rebecca's call suggested that at least some of them were beginning to understand the difference between achieving goals and building meaningful relationships. Diana had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought against external enemies, but against the parts of yourself that prevented you from becoming the person you were meant to be. It sounded like her siblings were finally fighting that battle, even if it had taken a medical crisis to force the confrontation. As her plane lifted off from Richmond that night, Diana wondered if it was possible to rebuild family relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect and misplaced priority. She didn't know if forgiveness was possible, or if trust could be restored, but she knew that Marcus was family, and family showed up when it mattered. The irony wasn't lost on her that once again she was the one dropping everything to support a family member in crisis. But this time, maybe, her siblings were beginning to understand what that kind of commitment actually meant, and what it cost the person who provided it. Whether this crisis would bring the family together or simply expose how far apart they'd grown remained to be seen. But Diana was determined to find out, because that's what her father would have wanted, and that's who she had always been, a person who showed up when others needed her most. The cardiac intensive care unit at Seattle General Hospital felt achingly familiar to Diana as she walked through the sterile corridors at 6 in the morning. The antiseptic smell, the hushed conversations, the weight of worry hanging in the air, all of it reminded her of the military hospitals where she'd spent so many hours as a combat medic, fighting to save lives that hung in the balance. She found Isabella first, curled up in an uncomfortable waiting room chair, still wearing the wrinkled business suit she'd apparently traveled in 3 days earlier. Diana's youngest half-sister looked up as she approached, and the transformation in her appearance was startling. The confident law school graduate who had taken notes so smugly during the will reading was gone, replaced by someone who looked exhausted, vulnerable, and much younger than her 26 years. "Diana?" Isabella's voice was hoarse from crying. "You came. I can't believe you actually came." Diana sat down in the chair beside her, noting the dark circles under Isabella's eyes and the way her usually perfect appearance had been abandoned in favor of simply being present. Rebecca said, "Marcus was asking for me. How is—" Isabella wiped her eyes with a tissue that had clearly been used many times. "The doctors say he's stable, but Diana, he looks so fragile. He's lost weight over the past year, and the stress has it's aged him. When he had the attack, he kept saying he needed to talk to you, that he had things he needed to say before it was too late." The phrase, "before it was too late," hit Diana hard, reminding her of her father's final weeks when he'd tried so desperately to reach out to his other children. The parallel wasn't lost on her that once again, a medical crisis was serving as a wake-up call for the Rodriguez family. "Can I see him?" Diana asked. Isabella nodded. "Rebecca's with him now. The ICU only allows 2 visitors at a time, but she'll want to see you." "Diana, there's something I need to tell you before you go in there." Diana waited, sensing that whatever Isabella was about to say had been weighing on her heavily. "I've been researching Dad's will for months, not to challenge it, but to understand it." Isabella began. "I thought maybe if I could find some legal technicality or procedural error, I could feel better about what happened, but Eleanor Hartwell's work was flawless. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence was perfectly documented." She pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase. "But in doing that research, I learned things about you that I never knew. Did you know that Dad kept copies of your military commendations? You have a Bronze Star, Diana. You saved 3 soldiers' lives under fire in Afghanistan, and you never once mentioned it to any of us." Diana felt uncomfortable with the attention. Military awards had always felt private to her, recognition for doing what any decent person would do in impossible circumstances. "I also found documentation of your PTSD treatment, and your struggles after coming home," Isabella continued, her voice growing softer. "Dad kept newspaper clippings about veteran suicide rates, and articles about the challenges female veterans face. He was so worried about you, Diana, and so proud of how you'd rebuilt your life." Isabella's revelations were painting a picture of a father who had understood Diana's struggles in ways she'd never realized. Roberto had watched her battle invisible demons while his other children pursued visible success, and he'd recognized the quiet heroism in her daily choice to keep moving forward. "The point is," Isabella said, "I finally understand why Dad's will was written the way it was. It wasn't about punishing us for our success. It was about recognizing that you had already sacrificed more, given more, and endured more than any of us. The inheritance wasn't a reward, it was justice." Rebecca appeared in the waiting room doorway, looking as exhausted as Isabella but with something like relief in her eyes. When she saw Diana, "He's awake," she said simply, "and he's been waiting for you." As Diana walked toward Marcus's room, she tried to prepare herself for what she might see. Her half-brother had always been the golden child, the one who seemed to have everything figured out. The idea of him lying helpless in a hospital bed felt surreal. Marcus looked smaller than she remembered, dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding his bed. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his face had a grayish pallor that spoke of serious illness, but his eyes were alert, and they filled with tears when he saw Diana enter the room. "You came," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought you might not, after everything." Diana pulled a chair close to his bed. Rebecca said, "You needed to see me." "I'm here." Marcus struggled to sit up slightly, wincing with the effort. "Diana, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "Okay." She nodded, settling back in the uncomfortable hospital chair. "I've been thinking about Dad every day since he died," Marcus began, his words coming slowly but with evident determination. "Not just about the will or the money, but about who he was and what he tried to teach. And I finally understand something that took me way too long to figure out." He paused, gathering strength for what was clearly a difficult confession. "Dad didn't love you more than the rest of us because you stayed local or because you helped him financially. He recognized that you were the only one of us who understood what love actually meant. Love isn't about grand gestures or impressive achievements, it's about showing up consistently, day after day, even when it's hard or inconvenient, or doesn't advance your own agenda." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I spent years judging you for not being ambitious enough, for not pursuing the kind of career that would impress people at cocktail parties, but you were busy living according to values that actually matter: service, loyalty, sacrifice, putting other people's needs ahead of your own comfort." Diana felt tears building in her eyes, but remained silent, honoring his request to let him finish. "The heart attack happened because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore," Marcus admitted. "Not just guilt about how we treated Dad, but guilt about how we treated you. You were our sister, and instead of celebrating your character and your service, we dismissed you as underachieving. We made you feel like you weren't good enough, when the truth was that we weren't good enough to understand what you represented." He reached out weakly toward her hand. "I don't expect forgiveness, Diana. I don't think I deserve it, but I needed you to know that I finally understand what Dad saw in you, and what the rest of us were too blind or too selfish to recognize." The room felt very quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Diana looked at her half-brother, seeing not the arrogant tech executive who had dismissed her father's medical needs, but a young man who had been forced to confront the hollowness of his own value system. "The question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness, Marcus," Diana said quietly. "The question is whether you're ready to do the work to become the kind of person who honors what Dad tried to teach all of us." Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I want to try. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to be better. Will you help me figure out how?" Outside the hospital room window, Seattle was waking up to another busy day, filled with people pursuing their own definitions of success and meaning. But inside the ICU, two siblings were beginning a conversation about what it truly meant to be family, and whether it was possible to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of misplaced priorities and wounded pride. Diana looked at Marcus, then thought about Rebecca and Isabella in the waiting room, and realized that perhaps her father's final gift hadn't just been the inheritance. Maybe it had been the crisis that forced all of them to confront who they really were and who they might still become. 2 weeks after Marcus's heart attack, Diana found herself in an unexpected place, sitting around a conference table in Eleanor Hartwell's Richmond office, with all three of her half-siblings, but this time the atmosphere was completely different from the tense will reading that had torn their family apart 18 months earlier. Instead of accusations and entitlement, there was something that might have been hope, fragile and uncertain but genuine. Marcus had been released from the hospital with strict orders to reduce stress, change his diet, and completely restructure his lifestyle. He'd taken a leave of absence from his consulting work, and had flown to Richmond at Diana's invitation, looking healthier than he had in months, but still bearing the sobering reality of his near-death experience. Eleanor Hartwell sat at the head of the table, but today she wasn't there as an executor reading legal documents. Diana had asked her to facilitate what she was calling a family restructuring meeting, and the experienced lawyer had agreed, intrigued by the possibility of witnessing healing rather than just delivering harsh truth. "I want to start by saying something," Diana began, her voice steady but carrying an emotion that hadn't been present during the original will reading. "The past 18 months have been difficult for all of us, but they've also been clarifying. I've learned things about myself, about our family, and about what Dad really wanted for us that I think we all need to discuss." Rebecca, who had driven down from D.C. where she was slowly rebuilding her real estate career with a focus on helping military families find homes, nodded encouragingly. The past year had humbled her in ways that had ultimately made her a more compassionate person, and surprisingly, a more successful agent, as she'd learned to connect with clients on a deeper level. Isabella, still working in patent law but now volunteering 20 hours a week at a legal aid clinic, had her familiar notepad, but instead of calculating inheritance percentages, she was taking notes about family dynamics and communication strategies they'd learned in counseling. "Marcus's health crisis made me realize that holding on to anger and resentment,
wasn't serving any of us, Diana continued. But more than that, it made me understand that Dad's will wasn't just about distributing assets, it was about teaching us something about what really mattered. She pulled out a folder that looked remarkably similar to the ones Eleanor had used during the original reading. I've been doing some thinking and some research of my own, about the business, about the inheritance, and about what Dad would want us to do moving forward. Eleanor watched with professional interest, wondering where Diana was heading with this unexpected family meeting. The construction company is doing well, Diana reported. Revenue is up 30% from last year. We've hired 12 new employees, and the employee satisfaction surveys show the highest morale in the company's history. The scholarship fund we established has helped 8 children of veterans and construction workers attend college this year. Marcus smiled weakly. Dad would be proud of what you've built, Diana. You've honored his legacy in ways that none of the rest of us could have. That's just it, Diana said, her voice growing more intense. It shouldn't just be me. Dad built that company for his family, all of his family. The will was designed to teach us a lesson, but I don't think the lesson was supposed to last forever. Rebecca looked confused. What do you mean? Diana opened her folder and pulled out several legal documents. I mean that I've been working with Eleanor to restructure the inheritance in a way that reflects what Dad would want now that we've all hopefully learned what he was trying to teach us. Eleanor cleared her throat. What Diana is proposing is quite unusual, but it's legally sound, and I believe reflects a mature understanding of family dynamics and personal growth. Diana looked at each of her siblings before continuing. I'm proposing to redistribute portions of the inheritance, but with conditions that reflect what we've all learned about responsibility, service, and family commitment. Isabella leaned forward, her legal training making her intensely curious about the specifics. Rebecca, Diana said, turning to her half-sister, you've spent the past year rebuilding your career around helping military families. You've also been attending therapy and working to understand how your priorities got so skewed. I want to offer you a partnership stake in a new division of Rodriguez Construction that would focus on building affordable housing for veterans and their families. Rebecca's eyes widened. Diana, I can't accept that, not after how I treated you and Dad. You can accept it, Diana said firmly, because you've done the work to become someone who would use that opportunity responsibly, but it comes with conditions. You'd need to relocate to Richmond, work directly with the company for at least 3 years, and demonstrate the same kind of commitment to the employees and their families that Dad always showed. She turned to Marcus. You've been volunteering with Veteran Support Services in Seattle, and you have business skills that could really help expand our impact. I want to offer you the opportunity to head up a new nonprofit arm of the company that would provide job training and placement services for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Marcus looked stunned. After everything I put you through, you'd trust me with something that important? I'd trust the person you're becoming, Diana corrected, but again, there are conditions. You'd need to complete a formal program in nonprofit management, work directly with veterans for at least 2 years, and prove that you can put service ahead of personal advancement. Finally, she looked at Isabella. Your legal skills could be invaluable in helping us navigate the regulations around veteran services and affordable housing development. I'd like you to consider becoming the company's general counsel, with a focus on ensuring we're always operating ethically and serving our community effectively. Isabella was quiet for a long moment. You're offering us a chance to earn back what we lost through our own action. I'm offering you a chance to become the people Dad always hoped we could be, Diana corrected. People who understand that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself but about what you contribute to others. Eleanor watched the siblings process Diana's proposal, impressed by the sophistication of her approach. Instead of simply forgiving past wrongs, Diana was creating a structure that would require genuine change and sustained commitment. There's one more condition, Diana. We establish a family foundation that requires all of us to contribute not just money, but time and effort to supporting veteran families and workers in the construction industry. No one gets to just write checks and walk away. Everyone has to stay involved, stay committed, and stay accountable to each other. Rebecca was the first to speak. You're giving us a chance to honor Dad's memory by becoming better people. I'm giving us all a chance to become the family Dad always wanted us to be, Diana replied. But only if you're willing to do the work, And only if you understand that this isn't about returning to the way things were, this is about building something new, based on what we've all learned about what really matters. Marcus struggled to sit up straighter, his recent health crisis lending weight to his words. I don't deserve this opportunity, Diana, but I want to earn it. I want to spend whatever time I have left making up for the time I wasted being selfish and blind. Isabella nodded slowly. It would mean changing everything about how I've been living my life, moving back to Richmond, working for the family business instead of a prestigious firm, measuring success differently. Yes, Diana said simply. It would mean choosing family and service over individual achievement. It would mean becoming the kind of people who show up when others need help, not just when it's convenient. The conference room fell silent as the three Martinez siblings contemplated Diana's offer. Outside Richmond continued its daily rhythm, but inside Eleanor Hartwell's office, a family was deciding whether they had the courage to transform their relationship from one based on competition and resentment, into one built on shared values and mutual commitment. Eleanor looked at Diana with something approaching awe. The quiet young woman who had sat through the original will reading in stunned silence, had become someone capable of both justice and mercy, someone who understood that true leadership meant creating opportunities for others to grow rather than simply punishing them for past failures. The decision each sibling made in the next few minutes would determine not just their financial future but the kind of people they would become and the legacy they would leave for the next generation of the Rodriguez family.
5 years after the will reading that had shattered and ultimately transformed the Rodriguez family, Diana stood on the construction site of the Roberto Rodriguez Memorial Veterans Village, watching as the final beam was installed on the community center that would serve as the heart of their affordable housing development. The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been an empty lot in Richmond's East End, but was now becoming home to 50 families of veterans and active-duty military personnel. The transformation wasn't just in the landscape. The Rodriguez family itself had been rebuilt from the ground up, stronger and more unified than they had ever been during Roberto's lifetime. What had started as a painful lesson in family loyalty had evolved into a shared mission that honored their father's memory while creating lasting change in their community. Rebecca approached Diana carrying 2 cups of coffee, her work boots crunching on the gravel as she navigated around construction equipment. Gone were the designer suits and manicured nails of her previous life. Rebecca had embraced her role as Director of Community Development for Rodriguez Construction's housing division, and her success in helping military families find not just homes but supportive communities had made her a respected figure in veteran advocacy circles across Virginia. Miguel says we're still on schedule for the ribbon cutting next month, Rebecca reported, settling beside Diana on a stack of lumber that served as their impromptu morning meeting spot. The Martinez family just got approved for the 3-bedroom unit on Maple Street, and Mrs. Patterson from the VA is bringing a group of social workers to tour the facilities next week. Diana smiled, remembering when Rebecca's idea of helping people was closing high-end real estate deals for wealthy clients. The woman beside her now had calloused hands from working alongside construction crews, and her face showed the satisfaction that came from work that served a purpose beyond personal profit. Marcus emerged from the community center carrying architectural plans and moving with the careful pace of someone who had learned to respect his body's limitations. His heart attack had been a wake-up call that had fundamentally changed his relationship with stress and success. As executive director of the Rodriguez Foundation's job training programs, he had channeled his business skills into creating pathways for veterans to find meaningful employment in construction, healthcare, and technology. The computer lab is almost ready, Marcus announced, joining his sister. We've got 15 veterans enrolled in the first cybersecurity certification program, and 3 companies have already committed to hiring our graduates. Diana, you should see the application essay from Sarah Chen. She's a Navy vet with 2 kids, been struggling to find work since her discharge. This program could change her whole family's trajectory. Diana felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing her siblings embrace work that mattered. Marcus had initially struggled with the transition from high-stakes consulting to nonprofit work, But he'd discovered that helping people build careers was more satisfying than helping corporations increase profit. His near-death experience had taught him that a life measured only by personal achievement was ultimately hollow. Isabella walked across the site carrying her laptop and a folder of legal documents, but her professional appearance now reflected purpose rather than ambition. As general counsel for all Rodriguez family enterprises, she had become an expert in veteran services law, housing regulations, and nonprofit compliance. Her work ensured that every aspect of their operations served their community effectively, while maintaining the highest ethical standard. The City Council approved our proposal for the second phase, Isabella announced, her voice carrying excitement rather than the calculated coolness of her former corporate demeanor. We can break ground on 20 more units next spring, plus the expanded childcare facility and the medical clinic. She handed Diana a letter with the official city seal. But the best news is this letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They want to use our model as a template for similar developments in 4 other states. Diana, what we've built here could help thousands of veteran families across the country. Diana read the letter, thinking about how their father would have reacted to the news that his construction company had become the foundation for a national model of veteran support. Roberto Rodriguez had built his business one project at a time, focusing on quality and integrity rather than expansion and profit. His children had learned to apply those same principles to their work, but with a scope he could never have imagined. Eleanor Hartwell appeared at the edge of the construction site, walking carefully in sensible shoes across the uneven ground. At 71, the lawyer had officially retired, but she continued to serve as an advisor to the Rodriguez Foundation, fascinated by the family's transformation and committed to ensuring that Roberto's legacy continued to serve its intended purpose. I have some news that I think will interest all of you, Eleanor said, accepting Isabella's offer of assistance in navigating the construction debris. I just received a call from the American Bar Association. They want to feature the Rodriguez family story in their quarterly journal as an example of how estate planning can be used not just to distribute wealth, but to teach values and create positive social change. She pulled out a formal letter from her briefcase. They're particularly interested in how Diana's decision to redistribute portions of the inheritance created accountability structures that ensured genuine character change, rather than just superficial compliance. Diana looked around at her siblings, each of whom had spent the past 5 years proving that they deserved the second chance she had offered them. Rebecca had relocated permanently to Richmond and had become a passionate advocate for affordable housing. Marcus had completed his nonprofit management certification and had dedicated himself to understanding the challenges faced by transitioning veterans. Isabella had taken a significant pay cut to leave her prestigious law firm, but had found fulfillment in using her skills to protect vulnerable populations. There's something else, Eleanor added with a smile. The article wants to include an update on the business itself. Rodriguez Construction is now the largest employer of veterans in Central Virginia. Your employee retention rate is the highest in the industry, and your profit-sharing program has been copied by companies across the state. Diana thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The will reading that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the beginning of a transformation that had affected not just their family, but hundreds of other families throughout their community. Roberto's harsh lesson in family loyalty had evolved into a legacy of service that would outlast all of them. Marcus checked his watch. I hate to break up this moment, but I have a conference call with the Department of Labor in 20 minutes. They want to discuss expanding our job training programs to include spouses of active duty military. Rebecca gathered her coffee cup and construction plans. And I have 3 families touring units this afternoon. The Hendersons just got back from deployment, and the Williams family is finally ready to transition out of transitional housing. Isabella closed her laptop and prepared to return to her office. I'll be reviewing contracts for the medical clinic all afternoon, but I wanted to remind everyone that we have the foundation board meeting Thursday evening. We're voting on the scholarship program expansion. As her siblings returned to their work, Diana remained on the construction site for a few more minutes, watching workers install windows in what would soon become someone's home. The sounds of construction hammers, saws, and heavy machinery were the same sounds her father had listened to for decades, but now they carried a different meaning. Roberto Rodriguez had built a business that employed people and served customers well. His children had taken that foundation and built something that employed veterans, housed families, trained workers, and created community. The inheritance he had left them wasn't just money and assets. It was an understanding of what it meant to use privilege and resources in service of others. Diana's phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel Santos, who was now construction manager for all Rodriguez projects. The Patterson family just got their keys. Mrs. Patterson is crying. She says it's the first time her kids will have their own bedroom since her husband's deployment ended. As Diana walked back toward her truck, she thought about the letter Rebecca had shown her that morning from a veteran's wife in California, asking how they could replicate the Rodriguez model in their community. The ripple effects of their father's will were expanding far beyond anything he could have anticipated when he'd sat down with Eleanor Hartwell to write his final wish. The inscription on the sign at the entrance to the veterans' village read, "In memory of Roberto Rodriguez, who taught his children that true success is measured not by what you achieve for yourself, but by what you create for others." It was a lesson that had taken 5 years, a family crisis and a near-death experience to fully understand, but it had ultimately transformed 4 siblings into the family their father had always hoped they could become. Diana drove home through Richmond's evening traffic, past the Rodriguez construction yard where her father had built his American dream, toward the house where she now lived with her own growing family, a house filled with love, purpose, and the satisfaction that came from work that mattered. The inheritance had given her financial security, but the real gift had been the opportunity to discover what it meant to build a legacy that would outlast them all. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Diana awake from the deep sleep she'd finally learned to achieve after years of military-induced insomnia. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen, the same oncologist who had treated their father years earlier, and her tone carried the weight of news that would test everything the Rodriguez family had built together. "Diana, I'm calling about Isabella. She asked me to contact you directly." Chen's voice was professional but gentle. "She was diagnosed yesterday with stage 2 breast cancer, the same aggressive type that took your stepmother, Carmen." Diana sat up in bed, the familiar rush of crisis management training kicking in even as her heart pounded with fear. "How bad is... What's the treatment plan?" "Caught early enough for excellent prognosis, but she'll need surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. The treatment will be intensive, lasting about 8 months. She'll need significant support, both medical and emotional." As Dr. Chen explained the details, Diana's mind was already working through logistics. Isabella lived alone in her downtown Richmond apartment, dedicating herself so completely to her legal work for the foundation that she'd never prioritized personal relationships. The irony wasn't lost on Diana that Isabella, who had once dismissed their father's cancer as dramatic, was now facing the same terrifying journey. 2 hours later, Diana sat in the waiting room of Richmond General's oncology wing, the same hospital where their father had undergone his heart surgery years earlier. The familiar antiseptic smell and hushed conversations brought back memories of sitting vigil, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't alone. Rebecca had driven down from a housing development site in Northern Virginia, still wearing her work clothes and carrying blueprints under her arm. Marcus had taken the first flight out of Seattle, where he'd been consulting with a veteran services organization about expanding their job training model. The 3 siblings who had once scattered to avoid family obligations were now converging without hesitation. "How long have you known?" Rebecca asked as soon as Diana saw her approaching through the hospital corridor. "Dr. Chen called me this morning. Isabella specifically asked her to contact family." Diana noted how natural it felt to include all of them in that word family, despite the years of dysfunction that had preceded their reconciliation. Marcus appeared moments later, slightly out of breath from rushing through the hospital. His own health scare had made him acutely aware of mortality, and the fear in his eyes was palpable. "Is she in surgery? Can we see her?" "Pre-op consultations," Diana explained. "She'll be out in about an hour." "Marcus, you look terrible. Are you taking care of yourself?" It was such a naturally concerned big sister comment that Marcus almost smiled despite the circumstances. 5 years ago, They barely spoke to each other. Now Diana's first instinct was to worry about his well-being. Isabella emerged from the consultation room looking smaller than usual. Despite her attempts to maintain her professional composure, she'd dressed carefully in one of her best suits, as if preparing for court rather than cancer treatment. But her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly as she approached her siblings. "You all came," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. "Of course we came," Rebecca said, pulling Isabella into a hug that would have been unthinkable during their estranged years. "We're family. This is what family does." The simple declaration carried weight that went far beyond the present crisis. It was an acknowledgement of how far they'd all traveled from the people they'd been during their father's illness, when family obligations had been viewed as inconveniences rather than sacred responsibility. Isabella looked at Diana with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been shame. "I keep thinking about how I reacted when Dad was diagnosed. How I told him he was being dramatic. That cancer was totally treatable these days. God, Diana. I was so cruel. You were scared and young and didn't understand what you were talking about." Diana replied gently. "That person doesn't exist anymore." Dr. Chen joined them in the family consultation room, a space Diana remembered well from their father's treatment. The oncologist looked at the assembled siblings with something like approval, clearly noting the difference in family dynamics from her previous experience with the Rodriguez family. "Isabella's case is actually quite optimistic," Dr. Chen began, spreading out medical charts and test results. "The tumor is contained. Her lymph nodes are clear and we caught it early. The treatment protocol will be aggressive but straightforward. Surgery next week, followed by 4 months of chemotherapy and 6 weeks of radiation." She looked directly at Isabella. "The biggest challenge will be managing your energy levels and maintaining your immune system during treatment. You'll need to significantly reduce your work schedule and accept help with daily tasks." Isabella's face showed the struggle between her ingrained independence and the reality of her situation. "I have 3 major cases pending, and the foundation's legal audit is scheduled for next month. I can't just stop working." "Actually, you can," Marcus said firmly. "Isabella, I took a leave of absence for my heart attack, and the foundation didn't collapse. Rebecca's been managing housing development projects while also running community outreach programs. Diana's been overseeing construction operations, veteran services, and nonprofit management simultaneously. We've all learned to ask for help when we need it." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "I can handle the legal audit. I've been working with those regulations for 3 years now, and I can coordinate with outside counsel for anything beyond my expertise. And I can take over your current cases. Diana, I may not have a law degree, but I know enough about our operations to manage day-to-day legal issues. And we can bring in contract attorneys for specialized work." Isabella looked around at her siblings, seeing something she'd never noticed before: a support system that functioned automatically without negotiation or guilt. When Marcus had his heart attack, Diana had flown to Seattle immediately. When Rebecca had struggled with her career transition, Marcus had provided business advice and emotional support. When Diana had needed help expanding the foundation's programs, Isabella had worked evenings and weekends to handle the legal complexity. "I'm scared," Isabella admitted, the words coming out quietly but clearly. "Not just about the cancer but about being vulnerable. About needing help. I've spent so many years trying to prove I was capable and independent." Diana reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "Being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to accept help from people who love you." The phrase carried particular weight coming from Diana, who had spent years providing help to others while rarely asking for support herself. Her military training had taught her about teamwork and interdependence, lessons that had taken her siblings much longer to learn. Dr. Chen watched the family dynamic with professional interest. In her 30 years of oncology practice, she'd seen how crucial family support was to patient outcomes, and she could already see that Isabella would have advantages that many of her patients lacked. "There's something else we need to discuss," Dr. Chen continued. Isabella, you mentioned that your stepmother died of the same type of cancer. Have any of you been tested for the BRCA gene mutations that can indicate hereditary breast and ovarian cancer risk? The question hit the room like a cold wind. None of them had considered that Isabella's diagnosis might have implications for Rebecca, or even for Diana, despite the fact that Carmen wasn't their biological mother. We should all get tested, Rebecca said immediately. If there's a genetic component, we need to know. And if Diana or I are at increased risk, we need to start preventive screening immediately. It was exactly the kind of practical family-first thinking that would have been impossible during their estranged years. Instead of avoiding difficult medical realities or leaving each person to handle their own risks, they were automatically thinking as a unit, planning to face potential challenges together. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. I don't know how I would have handled this 5 years ago. I probably would have tried to manage everything myself, pushed everyone away, and convinced myself that asking for help was a sign of weakness. 5 years ago we wouldn't have been here for you to ask, Marcus said honestly. We were all too busy with our own lives to notice when people we loved needed support. Diana looked around the consultation room, thinking about how many difficult conversations their family had shared in medical settings over the years. Their father's heart surgery, his cancer diagnosis, Marcus's heart attack, and now Isabella's cancer diagnosis. But this time felt different, not because the challenge was less serious, but because they were facing it together, as the family Roberto Rodriguez had always hoped they could become. So what's the plan? Diana asked, shifting into the organizational mode that had served her well in both military and civilian leadership roles. Isabella, you're moving in with me during treatment. Rebecca, can you handle the legal audit coordination? Marcus, can you extend your stay in Richmond to help manage foundation operations? Without hesitation, all 3 siblings nodded. The logistics would be complex, the emotional challenges significant, but there was no question that they would face Isabella's cancer journey as a united family, supporting each other through whatever came next. 4 months into Isabella's chemotherapy treatment, the Rodriguez family had settled into a rhythm that would have been unimaginable during their years of estrangement. Diana's house had transformed into a command center for both Isabella's care and the continued operations of their various family enterprises, with siblings, employees and medical professionals flowing through the space with the efficiency of a well-coordinated military operation. Isabella sat in the kitchen that had once belonged to their father, wearing a colorful headscarf that Rebecca had brought back from a housing development conference in Austin. The chemotherapy had taken her hair and much of her energy, but it hadn't diminished the sharp legal mind that had made her invaluable to the family foundation. Even on her worst days, she insisted on reviewing contracts and legal documents from the makeshift office Diana had set up in the living room. The BRCA test results came back, Isabella announced as Diana entered the kitchen carrying a stack of construction permits and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Dr. Chen wants to schedule a family meeting to discuss them. Diana felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. The genetic testing had revealed that Isabella carried the BRCA1 mutation, significantly increasing her risk for both breast and ovarian cancer. But the results for Diana and Rebecca were still pending, and the waiting had been almost as difficult as watching Isabella endure the physical effects of chemotherapy. When does she want to meet? Diana asked, settling into the chair across from Isabella and noting how much weight her sister had lost since treatment began. Despite Rebecca's efforts to prepare nutritious meals and Marcus's attempts to make eating more appealing with various smoothie concoctions, Isabella's appetite remained minimal. This afternoon, if possible, she said she wants all of us there. Isabella's voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The past 4 months had been emotionally draining for the entire family, forcing them to confront not just Isabella's mortality, but their own vulnerability and interdependence. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still wearing his running clothes and checking his phone for messages from the Seattle Foundation office he was managing remotely. His daily runs had become a crucial stress management tool, helping him maintain both his physical health and his emotional equilibrium during Isabella's treatment. Rebecca's on her way over from the Patterson project site, Marcus reported. The new families are moving in next week,
and she wanted to do final walkthroughs before Isabella's appointment. "How are you feeling today, Bella?" The nickname had emerged naturally during the intensive months of caregiving, a softening of formality that reflected the deeper intimacy their family had developed through shared crisis. Isabella managed a weak smile at the affectionate address. "Like I've been hit by a truck, but a truck that's fighting cancer," she replied, attempting humor despite her obvious fatigue. "Dr. Martinez said this is actually a good sign. The worse I feel, the harder the chemo is work." Diana admired her sister's determination to maintain optimism throughout the grueling treatment process. Isabella had approached cancer with the same methodical preparation she'd once applied to legal cases, researching treatment protocols, asking detailed questions about side effects, and maintaining detailed records of her symptoms and recovery progress. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later, her work boots muddy from the construction site, and her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd adopted since transitioning from real estate sales to housing development. She carried a folder of photos from the Veterans Housing Project, part of her ongoing effort to keep Isabella connected to their work even when she couldn't be physically present. "The Williams family got their keys this morning," Rebecca announced, spreading the photos across the kitchen table. "Their 8-year-old daughter Maya asked me to give you this." She handed Isabella a crayon drawing that showed a house with flowers in the yard and stick figures labeled "Our Family" standing in front of it. At the bottom, in careful second-grade handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Miss Isabella, for helping us get a home." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she studied the drawing. "She doesn't even know me. I've never met this little girl." "But your work helped make her new home possible," Marcus pointed out. "The legal structures you created, the contracts you negotiated, the compliance systems you designed, they're all part of why families like the Williams can have safe, affordable housing." The drawing represented something that had become increasingly important to Isabella during her treatment: the understanding that her work had meaning beyond professional achievement. Each contract she reviewed, each legal obstacle she navigated, each compliance system she designed contributed to real families finding stability and hope. Chen's office felt familiar now, a space where the Rodriguez family had shared both devastating news and hopeful updates over the months of Isabella's treatment. The oncologist had become something of a family friend, impressed by their transformation from the dysfunctional group she'd encountered during their father's illness to the supportive unit they'd become. "First, the most important news," Chen began, settling behind her desk with a stack of test results and medical files. "Isabella's latest scans show excellent response to treatment. The tumor has shrunk by nearly 70%, and there's no evidence of spread to other areas." The relief in the room was palpable. Rebecca reached over and squeezed Isabella's hand, while Marcus let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. Diana felt tears of gratitude welling up, remembering how different this medical journey had been from their father's illness. "The genetic testing results are more complex," Dr. Chen continued, opening another folder. "Isabella, as we discussed, you carry the BRCA1 mutation, which explains both your cancer risk and your excellent response to treatment. Rebecca, your test was negative for BRCA1 mutations, which means your risk level remains at population normal." Rebecca nodded, visibly relieved, but also somewhat guilty about escaping the genetic lottery that had affected Isabella. "Diana," Dr. Chen said, turning to address her directly, "your results were more surprising. You don't carry the BRCA1 mutation that Isabella inherited, but you do carry BRCA1 mutation that Isabella inherited, but you do carry BRCA1 mutation, which also increases cancer risk, though to a lesser degree. This means you'll need enhanced screening and preventive care." Diana processed the information with the same calm focus she'd applied to medical crises in Afghanistan. Having some cancer risk was concerning, but having a plan to monitor and manage that risk was empowering.
"What does this mean for all of us going forward?" Marcus asked, his experience with his own health crisis making him acutely aware of the importance of proactive medical management. Dr. Chen pulled out a comprehensive care plan she'd prepared. "Isabella will complete 2 more months of chemotherapy, followed by radiation treatment. Her prognosis is excellent, and with proper follow-up care, we expect full recovery. Diana will need enhanced screening starting immediately, including MRI and mammography, every 6 months." She looked around at all 4 siblings. But I want to address something else that's become clear during Isabella's treatment. The support system you've created, the way you've reorganized your lives and work to care for each other, this is exactly what families facing serious illness need. You've become a model for how to handle medical crises while maintaining both individual dignity and collective strength. Isabella looked around at her siblings, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. 2 years ago, she'd been an ambitious young lawyer focused primarily on her own career advancement. The combination of their father's will, Marcus's heart attack, and now her own cancer diagnosis had forced her to confront what really mattered in life. "I want to do something," Isabella said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "When I'm done with treatment, I want to establish a legal aid clinic specifically for families dealing with serious illness, help them navigate insurance issues, employment law, estate planning, medical advocacy, all the things we've learned to handle because we have resources and education." Rebecca smiled at the proposal. "We could partner it with the housing program. Families facing medical bankruptcy often lose their homes. Maybe we could create transitional housing specifically for people dealing with serious illness." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "And the foundation could provide job training and placement services for family members who need to change careers to accommodate caregiving responsibilities." Diana looked at her siblings, seeing how crisis had once again sparked innovation and service rather than despair. Their father's construction business had evolved into a comprehensive support system for veterans and working families, and now Isabella's cancer journey was inspiring them to extend that support to families facing medical crises. "Dad would be proud," Diana said simply, and everyone in the room knew it was true. Dr. Chen watched the family planning session with professional admiration. In her 30 years of practice, she'd learned that patients with strong family support systems had better outcomes, but she'd rarely seen a family transform crisis into opportunity for community service with such consistent dedication. As they left the medical center that afternoon, Isabella walking slowly but steadily between her siblings, Diana reflected on how different this family crisis had been from all the previous ones. Instead of scattering in self-protection or denial, they'd drawn closer together. Instead of letting fear and uncertainty divide them, they'd used those emotions to fuel creativity and service. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as the four Rodriguez siblings walked toward their cars, each carrying both the weight of ongoing challenges and the strength that came from facing those challenges together as a family. "You don't deserve this." Part 13. 8 months after Isabella's diagnosis, the Rodriguez family found themselves back in Eleanor Hartwell's conference room, but this time they had requested the meeting. The contrast with their previous gatherings in this space was striking. Instead of tension and accusations, there was a sense of purpose and unity that would have been impossible to imagine during their earlier encounter. Isabella sat at the table wearing a wig that Rebecca had helped her select, looking healthier than she had in months. Her final chemotherapy session had been completed 2 weeks earlier, and while she still tired easily, her energy and optimism were steadily returning. More importantly, her latest scans had shown no evidence of cancer, officially putting her in remission. Eleanor Hartwell, now 73 but still sharp as ever, reviewed the legal documents spread across the mahogany table with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed an extraordinary family transformation. The papers represented not just financial restructuring, but a formalization of the values and priorities the Rodriguez siblings had developed through years of crisis and growth. "This is quite unprecedented," Eleanor observed, adjusting her reading glasses to review the proposed changes to the family foundation structure. "In my 40-plus years of estate law, I've never seen a family voluntarily restructure an inheritance to expand their charitable obligations, rather than their personal benefits." Diana nodded, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Our father's will taught us that inheritance isn't just about money, it's about responsibility. What we're proposing today is an extension of that lesson." The documents outlined an ambitious expansion of the Rodriguez family's philanthropic efforts, building on the success of their veteran housing and job training programs, to create a comprehensive support network for families facing medical crises. Isabella's experience with cancer had revealed gaps in the social safety net that their resources and expertise could help fill. Marcus, who had permanently relocated to Richmond to oversee the foundation's operations, pulled out a detailed financial analysis. We're proposing to donate an additional $2 million from the family inheritance to establish the Rodriguez Family Medical Crisis Support Center. The facility would provide temporary housing, legal aid, job training, and care coordination for families dealing with serious illness. Rebecca added her own stack of architectural plans and zoning documents. I've been working with the city planning department for the past 3 months. We can build the facility on the lot adjacent to the Veterans Village, creating a comprehensive campus of support services. The housing units would be designed specifically for families with medical needs, accessible bathrooms, wheelchair ramps, medication storage area. Eleanor studied the plans with professional interest, but also with personal admiration for how far this family had traveled from their original dysfunction. The legal structure you're proposing would make this one of the largest family foundations in Virginia focused specifically on medical crisis support. Have you considered the ongoing administrative burden this will create? Isabella smiled, the first genuinely confident expression Eleanor had seen from her since before the cancer diagnosis. Actually, that's the best part. I'm resigning from my law firm to become the foundation's full-time general counsel and executive director. The past 8 months have shown me that using my legal skills to help families navigate medical crises is more fulfilling than any corporate work I've ever done. The announcement represented a dramatic career shift for Isabella, who had spent years building her reputation in patent law, but her experience as a cancer patient had given her insights into the legal challenges facing seriously ill patients that no law school could provide. I'll be working directly with patients and families to handle insurance disputes, employment discrimination issues, estate planning during illness, and medical advocacy. Isabella continued, we're also planning to train a network of volunteer lawyers to provide pro bono services throughout Central Virginia. Marcus pulled out another folder filled with partnership agreements and collaboration letters. We've already got commitments from Richmond General, VCU Medical Center, and 3 private oncology practices to refer patients who need our services. The Department of Veterans Affairs wants to partner with us to serve veteran families, and the National Cancer Society has expressed interest in using our model in other cities. Eleanor reviewed the partnership documents, impressed by the thoroughness of their planning. You've essentially created a new social service model. Most families facing serious illness struggle with housing, income, insurance, and legal issues simultaneously, but there's rarely a single organization equipped to address all those needs. Diana nodded. That's exactly what we learned during Isabella's treatment. Even though we had resources and education, navigating the medical system while maintaining work and family obligations was overwhelming. For families without our advantages, it must be nearly impossible. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Eleanor's assistant entered with a message that made the elderly lawyer smile. There's a call from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. They want to interview the family about the foundation expansion. Apparently word has gotten out about your plans, and there's significant community interest. Rebecca looked around at her siblings with something like amazement. Remember when we were worried about people talking about us after Dad's will? Now we're actively seeking publicity for our work. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. 5 years earlier, the family had been the subject of local gossip about dysfunction and greed. Now they were becoming known for innovation and generosity. Isabella pulled out a letter from her purse, smoothing it carefully on the table. I want to read something that arrived this morning. It's from Maya Williams, the 8-year-old whose family moved into our veterans' housing. She cleared her throat and began reading in a voice that carried both emotion and determination. Dear Miss Isabella, my mom told me you were sick but you're getting better now. She said you helped make our house possible even when you were in the hospital. I want to be a lawyer like you when I grow up so I can help families like you helped us. I drew you a picture of you in court wearing a superhero cape, because my mom says that's what you are. Love, Maya. The letter came with a crayon drawing showing a stick figure in a business suit with a flowing cape, standing in front of what was clearly meant to be a courthouse. At the bottom, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, Super Lawyer Isabella. The room fell silent, as everyone absorbed the impact of Maya's letter. Here was a child whose life had been changed by their work, who now aspired to help others in the same way. It was the kind of ripple effect their father had probably never imagined when he wrote his challenging will. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, moved by both the letter and the transformation she'd witnessed in this family. Your father would be extraordinarily proud of what you've built together. Not just the financial success or the community impact, but the way you've learned to support each other through genuine crises. Marcus looked around the table at his sisters, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. You know what's interesting? We spent so many years competing with each other, trying to prove who was most successful or most deserving of Dad's approval. But the real success came when we stopped competing and started collaborating. Diana nodded, remembering the lonely years when she'd been the only one staying close to home, feeling dismissed and undervalued by her siblings. Dad's will forced us to confront our priorities, but it was Isabella's illness that taught us what we were really capable of when we worked together. Isabella folded Maya's letter carefully and returned it to her purse. I keep thinking about something Dr. Chen said during one of my appointments. She told me that families who face serious challenges together often become stronger than families who never face any challenges at all. I think that's what happened to us. Rebecca gathered the architectural plans and legal documents, preparing for the next phase of their ambitious project. So we're really doing this. We're committing another $2 million and restructuring our entire professional lives around helping families we've never met. We're doing this, Diana confirmed, speaking for all of them, because this is who we've become. This is who Dad always hoped we could be. Eleanor began organizing the documents for filing, already planning the legal steps necessary to implement their vision. As she worked, she reflected on the extraordinary journey she'd witnessed from initial family destruction to this moment of unified purpose. Outside the conference room windows, Richmond continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside this familiar space, a family was formalizing their commitment to transform personal pain into community healing, ensuring that their father's legacy of service would continue growing for generations to come. 2 years after Isabella's cancer diagnosis, the Rodriguez Family Medical Crisis Support Center was preparing for its grand opening, but the ceremony was overshadowed by an unexpected challenge that would test everything the family had built together. The call had come at dawn from Miguel Santos, his voice tight with concern as he delivered news that sent Diana's blood pressure spiking. There's been an accident at the construction site, Miguel reported, his words careful but urgent. Rebecca was doing the final safety inspection when part of the scaffolding collapsed. She's conscious, but they're taking her to Richmond General with possible spinal injury. Diana felt the familiar surge of crisis management training, the same calm focus that had served her in Afghanistan now applied to a family emergency, but this time the fear was different, more personal, more devastating than anything she'd faced in combat. How? Diana asked, already reaching for her keys and mentally calculating the fastest route to the hospital. Unknown. She was able to move her arms and talk, but the paramedics were concerned about her back and legs. Diana, she kept asking about the opening ceremony, whether we'd have to cancel it, even loaded into the ambulance. She was worried about disappointing the families. That was Rebecca perfectly, Diana thought. The sister who had once been too busy with real estate deals to visit their dying father was now so committed to helping families in crisis that her first concern from an ambulance was whether her injury would impact their work. The emergency room at Richmond General felt like a second home to the Rodriguez family after years of medical crises, but this time Diana was the one sitting in the waiting room, trying to manage her anxiety while Isabella and Marcus drove in from their respective morning meetings. The irony wasn't lost on her that Rebecca was injured at the medical support center they'd built to help other families navigate exactly this kind of crisis. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the emergency room physician, emerged from the treatment area with an expression that Diana couldn't quite read. Rodriguez, your sister is stable, but we need to discuss her injuries and treatment options. Diana felt her world narrow to the doctor's next words, remembering how many times she'd been the one delivering similar news to families in military hospitals. Rebecca has sustained significant trauma to her lower spine. The initial X-rays show compression fractures at L2 and L3, with possible nerve involvement. We're preparing her for emergency surgery to stabilize the vertebrae and prevent further damage. The clinical language couldn't mask the seriousness of the situation.
Diana had seen enough spinal injuries during her military service to understand the potential implications: paralysis, chronic pain, permanent disability, fundamental changes to everything Rebecca had worked to build. "What's the prognosis for recovery?" Diana asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "Too early to determine. The surgery will tell us more about the extent of nerve damage. Best case scenario, she makes a full recovery with some ongoing back pain. Worst case." Dr. Walsh paused, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. "We need to prepare for the possibility of permanent mobility issues." Isabella and Marcus arrived within minutes of each other, both looking like they'd dropped everything to race to the hospital. The sight of her siblings immediately converging in crisis reminded Diana of how far they'd all traveled from the people who had scattered during their father's illnesses. "How is she?" Isabella asked, still wearing the professional suit that had become her uniform as Foundation director, but with the kind of raw worry that no amount of legal training could mask. "Surgery in an hour," Diana reported. "Spinal compression fracture. We won't know the extent of the damage until after the operation." Marcus sank into one of the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, his own health crisis making him acutely aware of how quickly life could change. "She was so excited about the opening ceremony. She's been working 16-hour days for the past month, making sure every detail was perfect for the families." The opening ceremony they'd planned for the next week represented more than just a new facility. It was the culmination of years of work transforming their father's legacy from a construction business into a comprehensive support network for families in crisis. 50 families were scheduled to tour the new facilities, and representatives from medical centers across Virginia were coming to learn about their innovative model. Isabella pulled out her phone and began making the calls that Diana hadn't even thought about yet: postponing meetings, rearranging schedules, coordinating with staff to ensure the Foundation's operations could continue despite the crisis. It was exactly the kind of automatic family support that would have been unthinkable during their estranged years. "I'm canceling the opening ceremony," Diana announced, the decision feeling both obvious and heartbreaking. "We can't celebrate while Rebecca is fighting for her mobility." "No." The voice came from behind them, weak but unmistakably determined. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, supported by a nurse and clearly medicated for pain, but with the same stubborn expression she'd worn as a child when told she couldn't do something. "Rebecca, what are you doing out here?" Isabella rushed to her sister's side, noting the hospital gown and the obvious discomfort in every movement. "I heard you talking about canceling the ceremony," Rebecca said, accepting Isabella's support but maintaining her determined posture. "You can't do that. Those families have been waiting months to see the facility. The medical center representatives are flying in from 4 states. This is bigger than my accident." Diana looked at her sister with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Rebecca, you're about to have spinal surgery." "The ceremony can wait." "The ceremony goes on," Rebecca insisted, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious pain. "Diana, remember what you taught me about military service. Sometimes the mission is more important than individual comfort. This facility represents hope for hundreds of families. We don't postpone hope because one person gets hurt." Dr. Walsh appeared with an orderly and a wheelchair. "Ms. Martinez, you need to get back to pre-op immediately. The surgical team is ready, and any delay increases the risk of complications." As Rebecca was helped into the wheelchair, she grabbed Diana's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me the ceremony happens as scheduled. Promise me that if something goes wrong in surgery, you'll still open the center. Dad would want the work to continue." The request carried weight that went beyond the immediate crisis. Rebecca was asking Diana to prioritize their collective mission over personal fear, the same way Diana had prioritized family over individual comfort during years of caregiving. "I promise," Diana said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're going to be fine, and you're going to be there to cut the ribbon yourself." As Rebecca disappeared into the surgical suite, the 3 remaining siblings settled into the familiar routine of medical crisis management. Isabella coordinated with Foundation staff to ensure all programs could continue operating. Marcus reached out to the medical center partners to explain the situation while confirming that the ceremony would proceed as planned. Diana focused on the logistics of supporting Rebecca's recovery while maintaining their commitment to the families depending on their services. the waiting room gradually filled with an unexpected group of supporters. Miguel Santos arrived with several construction workers who had witnessed the accident. Dr. Chen appeared during her lunch break, having heard about Rebecca's injury through the hospital network. Maya Williams, now 10 years old and accompanied by her mother, brought a hand-drawn card with the message, "Get well soon, Miss Rebecca," decorated with flowers and hearts. Eleanor Hartwell, despite her advanced age, made the trip to the hospital carrying a briefcase filled with legal documents related to the foundation's operation. "I wanted to ensure that any medical decisions could be made without bureaucratic delays," she explained, demonstrating the same thoroughness that had characterized her legal career. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Diana reflected on how different this crisis felt from their father's illnesses. Instead of scattering in self-protection, they had drawn closer together. Instead of viewing family obligations as burdens, they saw them as opportunities to demonstrate love through action. The surgical team finally emerged after 4 hours, Dr. Patricia Stevens, looking tired but cautiously optimistic. "The surgery went well. We were able to stabilize the vertebrae and decompress the affected nerves. Rebecca is awake and has good sensation in both legs, which is an excellent sign." The relief in the waiting room was palpable, but Dr. Stevens continued with necessary cautions. "Recovery will be long and challenging. She'll need extensive physical therapy, and there will likely be ongoing pain management issues, but based on what we saw today, I'm optimistic about her regaining full mobility." As Diana, Isabella and Marcus prepared to see Rebecca in recovery, Diana thought about the promise she'd made to continue with the opening ceremony. Tomorrow they would celebrate the completion of a facility designed to help families navigate exactly the kind of crisis they were experiencing today. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Rebecca's accident had provided the ultimate test of whether their family transformation was genuine, and whether their father's legacy of service could survive even when serving others came at significant personal cost. 1 week after Rebecca's surgery, the grand opening of the Rodriguez Family Medical Crisis Support Center proceeded as planned, but what happened that day would become the stuff of local legend, a story that would be retold for generations, as the ultimate testament to what family sacrifice and true success really meant. Diana stood at the podium on the steps of the gleaming new facility, looking out at a crowd that had swelled far beyond their expectation. What was supposed to be a modest ceremony for 50 families and medical professionals had become a community celebration attended by over 300 people. Veterans, construction workers, medical staff, city officials and families from across Virginia had come to witness not just the opening of a building, but the culmination of an extraordinary transformation. Behind her, the Rodriguez Family Medical Crisis Support Center rose like a beacon of hope, its warm brick facade and welcoming design reflecting years of careful planning and genuine understanding of what families in crisis truly need. Adjacent to the Veterans Village, the facility represented the evolution of their father's simple construction business into something that touched thousands of lives. Rebecca sat in a wheelchair in the front row, her back still fragile from surgery but her determination undiminished. She wore the same professional attire she'd favored during her real estate career, but now it carried a different meaning, representing not personal ambition, but service to others. Isabella and Marcus flanked her, their presence both protective and proud. 7 years ago, Diana began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "My siblings and I sat in a lawyer's office, and heard words that shattered everything we thought we knew about family, success and what we deserved from life." The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to hear something profound. "My sister Rebecca told me, 'You don't deserve this,' referring to the inheritance our father had left me, and you know what, she was absolutely right." Diana paused, letting the admission sink in. "I didn't deserve it. None of us deserved anything, because deserving isn't about what you accomplish for yourself, it's about what you sacrifice for others." Diana gestured toward the facility behind her. "This building exists because my father, Roberto Rodriguez, understood something that took his children years to learn. True wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away. Real success isn't about achieving your own dreams, but about making other people's dreams possible." Eleanor Hartwell sat in the audience, tears streaming down her weathered face as she witnessed the final chapter of the most extraordinary family transformation she'd ever seen. At 75, she had thought she'd seen everything in estate law, but the Rodriguez family had taught her that the most powerful inheritance wasn't money, it was wisdom. When my father wrote his will, Diana continued, he wasn't punishing 3 of his children for their success. He was teaching all 4 of us that success without service is hollow, that achievement without sacrifice is meaningless, and that family isn't about what you can get from each other, but what you're willing to give. Isabella struggled to stand from her wheelchair, accepting Marcus's support as she rose to address the crowd. Her hair, now growing back in soft curls after chemotherapy, caught the afternoon sunlight as she spoke.
3 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, Isabella said, her voice carrying across the crowd with surprising strength. I could have faced that battle alone. The way we used to handle everything in our family, everyone for themselves. Everyone protecting their own interests. Instead, my siblings dropped everything to care for me, to support me, to carry me through the darkest period of my life. She looked directly at Diana. That's when I finally understood what our father's will really meant. Diana didn't inherit everything because she was perfect. She inherited everything because she had spent years practicing the art of putting others first. The money was just recognition of character that already existed. Rebecca, despite her doctor's advice to remain seated, insisted on standing with Isabella's and Diana's help. Her voice was weaker than usual, but her message was powerful. I want to read something, Rebecca announced, pulling out a folded letter from her jacket pocket. This arrived yesterday, addressed to all 4 Rodriguez siblings. She unfolded the paper with careful movements, mindful of her healing spine. It's from Carmen Santos, Miguel's wife. She writes, Dear Rodriguez family, my husband has worked for your family's company for 20 years. He came home yesterday and told me about Miss Rebecca's accident and how she insisted the ceremony continue even though she was hurt. He said she told the workers that the mission was more important than any one person's comfort. Rebecca paused, emotion evident in her voice. She continues, I wanted you to know that my family has watched all of you grow and change over the years. We remember when you barely spoke to each other, when you seemed to care more about your own lives than your father's business. But we also saw how you came together when your father was sick, how you supported each other through illnesses and challenges, how you turned your inheritance into a gift for our entire community. The crowd was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. But here's the part that made me cry, Rebecca continued, her voice breaking slightly. Carmen writes, yesterday, when Miss Rebecca was lying hurt on the ground, she asked Miguel to make sure the opening ceremony happened, because families were depending on it. That's when I realized that your father's greatest achievement wasn't building a successful business, it was raising children who learned that real love means showing up for others, even when it costs you everything. Rebecca folded the letter carefully. She ends with this, you have shown our community what it means to turn pain into purpose, crisis into compassion, and inheritance into service. Your father is not just resting in peace, he is rejoicing in pride. Marcus took the microphone, his own voice thick with emotion. There's something else you should know about this ceremony today. When Rebecca was injured, we discovered that she had been working 18-hour days for the past month. Not because she had to, but because she was personally reviewing every detail to ensure this facility would serve families with the same care she wished our family had received when our father was sick. He gestured toward the building. Every room in this facility was designed based on lessons we learned from our own medical crises. The family consultation rooms have comfortable seating because we remember sitting in hard hospital chairs during Isabella's cancer treatment. The children's areas have educational materials because we know kids need to understand what's happening to their parents. The legal aid offices have private entrances because families dealing with medical bankruptcy need dignity along with help. Deanna took the microphone for the final time, looking out at a crowd that included the families who would be the first to benefit from the center, the medical professionals who would partner with them, and the community that had supported their transformation. Today we're not just opening a building, Deanna said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned leadership through service. "We're proving that our father's lesson about inheritance can spread beyond one family to transform an entire community." She pulled out a document that Eleanor Hartwell had prepared the night before. "That's why I'm announcing today that the Rodriguez family is donating the remaining $2 million of our inheritance to establish the Roberto Rodriguez National Foundation for Family Service. This foundation will help other families across the country learn what we learned, that real inheritance isn't about what you receive, it's about what you give." The crowd erupted in applause, but Deanna raised her hand for silence. "And there's one more thing. Something I've never told anyone, not even my siblings." Deanna's voice dropped to a more intimate tone. "The night before our father died, he called me to his bedside. He was weak, but his mind was clear. He told me something that I've carried with me through every challenge we've faced." The crowd leaned forward, sensing they were about to hear something profound. He said, "Miga, I'm not leaving you the inheritance because you're the best daughter. I'm leaving it to you because you're the daughter who will know what to do with it. The others will learn, but they need to want to learn first. My will isn't about money. It's about teaching them that real wealth comes from serving others." Deanna's voice grew stronger. He said, "Someday when they understand what family really means, when they choose love over ambition and service over success, then you'll know what to do with what I've given you. You'll share it, not because you have to, but because that's who you've always been." Isabella and Marcus looked at Deanna with wonder, realizing that their sister had been carrying their father's true intention for years, waiting for them to become the people worthy of understanding it. "So today," Deanna concluded, "I'm fulfilling the real purpose of our father's will, not to punish or reward, but to teach. And the lesson is this: you don't inherit love, you earn it through service. You don't inherit respect, you build it through sacrifice. And you don't inherit family, you become family by choosing to put others first, again and again, until it becomes who you are." As Deanna stepped back from the podium, something unprecedented happened. The crowd, moved by the power of the story they'd just heard, began to spontaneously share their own stories of service and sacrifice. Veterans spoke about comrades who had saved their lives. Medical professionals talked about patients who had taught them about courage. Families shared how they had supported each other through crisis. What had started as a building dedication had become a community testimony about the power of putting others first. As the formal ceremony concluded and families began touring the new facility, Deanna found herself standing with her siblings, in the same configuration they'd held 7 years earlier in Eleanor Hartwell's conference room, but everything else had changed. Rebecca, despite her wheelchair, radiated the satisfaction that came from work that mattered. Isabella glowed with the health of someone who had survived cancer and found purpose beyond personal ambition. Marcus carried himself with the confidence of someone who had transformed personal crisis into community service. And Deanna, who had once been dismissed as the underachieving daughter, now stood as the architect of a transformation that had touched thousands of lives. Eleanor Hartwell approached the 4 siblings, carrying a final folder of documents. "There's one last thing," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. "I've been contacted by families in 12 states who want to replicate your model. Medical centers in 4 countries have requested consultation about your approach to family crisis support. And the Harvard Kennedy School wants to do a case study on your family's transformation for their course on leadership and social change." She handed Deanna the folder. "Roberto's will has become a template not just for family healing, but for community transformation. You've proven that personal pain can become public purpose, that family dysfunction can become social innovation, and that inheritance can be a tool for creating justice rather than perpetuating privilege." As the sun set over Richmond that evening, casting long shadows across the medical center that bore their father's name, the 4 Rodriguez siblings stood together knowing they had fulfilled not just the letter of their father's will, but its deepest spiritual intention. They had learned that true inheritance isn't about what you deserve, it's about what you do with what you've been given. They had discovered that real family isn't created by blood or biology, but by the choice to show up for each other again and again, especially when it's difficult. Most importantly, they had proven that the greatest legacy you can leave isn't money or property, but the example of a life lived in service to others, a life that transforms pain into purpose and turns individual blessings into community healing. Roberto Rodriguez had built a construction company that employed 50 people. His children had built a legacy that would serve thousands of families for generations to come. The inheritance had been transformed from a source of division into a foundation for unity, from a symbol of favoritism into a model of justice, from a family's private business into a community's public blessing. And in that transformation, 4 siblings, who had once fought over what they deserved, had discovered something far more valuable: the joy that comes from giving others what they need, the satisfaction that comes from turning privilege into service, and the peace that comes from knowing that your life has made other lives better. As they walked together toward their cars that evening, Deanna thought about her father's words. "You don't deserve this." He had been right, but not in the way any of them had understood at the time. None of them had deserved the inheritance because deserving was never the point. The point was becoming the kind of people who would use whatever they received in service of others, the kind of people who measured wealth by what they gave away rather than what they accumulated. In the end, Roberto Rodriguez's will had accomplished something far more valuable than distributing money. It had transformed 4 strangers who happened to share a father into a family united by purpose, a family that had learned the most important lesson of all, that real inheritance is not what you receive from the past, but what you create for the future. And that future, built on the foundation of service, sacrifice, and unshakable family love, stretched out before them like a promise that their father's legacy would continue growing, touching lives not yet born, serving families not yet in crisis, proving again and again that the greatest inheritance of all is the example of a life lived for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.